The first time I heard my father beg for mercy. He was standing in front of cameras outside the county courthouse, sweat dripping down his neck despite the cold October wind. "Daniel," he hissed at me through clenched teeth, trying to keep a smile for the reporters, "you have no idea what you're doing." But I did. By then, the military records had already been verified. The hidden tapes had already been copied. And the story my grandfather had carried in silence for 70 years was finally crawling into the daylight like something too heavy to stay buried anymore. My father looked terrified. Not angry. Terrified. And standing there in that crowd of reporters and veterans, I suddenly remembered the last thing my grandfather ever said to me before he died. "Don't let them find it first." At the time, I thought he was confused from the morphine. Turns out, he knew exactly what he was talking about. 3 months earlier, none of this existed in my life. Back then, I was just a tired 58-year-old man driving an aging Ford pickup through western Pennsylvania every Sunday morning to visit an old Korean War veteran everyone else had forgotten. My grandfather, Walter Harper, lived in a nursing home outside Altoona. It wasn't the worst place in the world, but it wasn't far from it either. The wallpaper curled near the ceilings. The hallways smelled faintly like bleach and canned soup. Half the television sets were stuck on cable news 24 hours a day. The nurses did what they could. Most of them were kind. Overworked, but kind. Still, it wasn't where a man like Walter deserved to end up. Not after the life he'd lived. The sad thing was, if you met him, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything special at all. My grandfather was quiet. Not bitter, not angry, just quiet. He wore old flannel shirts buttoned to the top. He drank weak coffee. He folded newspapers neatly after reading them. He tipped waitresses too much and never complained about anything. If somebody thanked him for his military service, he'd nod once and change the subject. That was Walter Harper, a man who spent his whole life carrying things silently. My parents, on the other hand, treated him like an inconvenience that refused to die. My father, Richard Harper, owned a successful legal consulting firm near Pittsburgh. My mother spent most of her time at charity luncheons, pretending to care about people she'd never speak to twice. They lived in one of those giant stone houses where nobody actually sat in the living room. And somehow over the years they convinced themselves that Grandpa Walter embarrassed them. Maybe because he never made much money. Maybe because he still talked like a working man. Or maybe because old age reminds certain people of things they'd rather not face. Whatever the reason, they stopped visiting him years ago. At first it was excuses. Work. Travel. Bad weather. Then eventually, nothing. No calls. No birthdays. No holidays. Nothing except me. Every Sunday I made the drive. Sometimes Grandpa and I barely talked for 10 minutes straight. We'd sit by the window in the common room watching birds land near the parking lot feeder. Other times he'd tell little stories, never war stories. Just regular things. Fishing with his brother in 1952. His first Buick. The hardware store where he worked 30 years. The way my grandmother used to hum while washing dishes. Small memories. Quiet memories. The kind that disappear forever when somebody dies. One Sunday in November, I arrived earlier than usual because rain was coming down in sheets across Route 22. I found Grandpa sitting alone near the front window wearing his brown cardigan, waiting. I knew immediately what he was doing. "He coming?" I asked gently. Grandpa kept staring toward the parking lot. He said maybe he answered. That hurt worse than if he'd sounded angry, because there was still hope in his voice. My father never came. About an hour later, one of the nurses pulled me aside while Grandpa slept in his chair. "She worries me," I said quietly. The nurse gave me a tired look. "No," she answered softly, "he worries us." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the hallway before speaking. "Every Sunday morning he sits by that window waiting for family." She paused. "You're the only one who ever shows up." I didn't know what to say after that. A week later, the nursing home called me at 2:13 in the morning. By the time I arrived, Grandpa's breathing sounded shallow and uneven. The room was dark except for a small lamp near the bed. Rain tapped softly against the window. I sat beside him for nearly 3 hours. At one point he opened his eyes halfway. Cloudy blue. Weak. But clear enough to recognize me. "Danny," he whispered. "I'm here, Grandpa." His hand trembled as he reached for mine. Then his fingers tightened surprisingly hard. "There's something hidden," he whispered slowly. "In the cabin." I leaned closer. "What cabin?" "The mountain cabin." His breathing rattled painfully. "Don't let them find it first." "Who?" But he never answered. A few minutes later his breathing stopped. Just like that. No dramatic speech. No movie scene. Just silence. The nurse covered him carefully and rested her hand on my shoulder. I remember staring at the floor thinking one terrible thing over and over. Nobody should leave this world that alone. The funeral happened 3 days later. Cold gray skies, bare trees, veteran honor guard. My parents arrived 20 minutes late in a black Mercedes. My mother cried loudly when other people were watching. My father mostly checked his phone. After the burial, while people gathered near the church fellowship hall, eating ham sandwiches and potato salad, I overheard my father talking to a real estate agent. "That old cabin's probably worthless," he muttered, "but the land might still sell." Something inside me hardened when I heard that. Not rage exactly. Something colder. That evening, the lawyer handling Grandpa's estate called me aside. "There's something unusual," he said. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single key, and paperwork transferring ownership of Walter Harper's old mountain cabin entirely to me. Not my father, me. At the bottom of the page was Grandpa's shaky signature. Under it, he'd written one sentence by hand. "He'll understand." I didn't understand anything yet. But 3 days later, I packed my truck and drove toward the mountains of West Virginia, straight toward the secret my grandfather had protected his entire life. The road into West Virginia narrowed the farther south I drove. By the time I crossed the state line, the 4-lane highway had given way to winding mountain roads, lined with bare trees and old gas stations that looked untouched since the Reagan administration. Rain drifted across the hills in soft gray curtains. I kept hearing my grandfather's final words in my head. "Don't let them find it first." The strange thing was, Grandpa Walter had never been dramatic a single day in his life. He wasn't the type to invent mysteries, which meant whatever he'd hidden in that cabin mattered enough for him to carry it to his deathbed. I stopped once for coffee outside Clarksburg. The waitress called everybody hon and refilled my cup 3 times without asking. 2 old men argued about the Steelers near the counter while country music crackled softly through ceiling speakers. Normal life. Ordinary life. And meanwhile, I was driving towards something that already felt bigger than I understood. The cabin sat nearly 40 minutes off the main road, tucked deep into the mountains near an old trout stream Grandpa used to fish when I was a kid. The gravel driveway was half washed out from years of neglect. When I parked the truck, silence settled around me so completely I could hear water dripping from pine branches. The place looked smaller than I remembered. A 1-story cabin with faded green paint, a rusted tin roof, and a crooked front porch, leaning slightly to one side. One shutter hung loose beside the front window. Nobody had lived there full-time in years. Still, standing there brought back memories I hadn't thought about in decades. Summer evenings catching fireflies. My grandmother frying bacon in the tiny kitchen. Grandpa teaching me how to split firewood without smashing my fingers. Back then, the cabin felt safe. Now it felt like walking into somebody's unfinished confession. The front door groaned when I unlocked it. Cold air spilled out, carrying the smell of cedar wood dust, old paper, and faint traces of pipe tobacco. Nothing had changed. Not really. The same plaid sofa still sat near the stone fireplace. Old fishing magazines remained stacked beside Grandpa's recliner. A small radio rested on the shelf near the kitchen, exactly where he'd always kept it. It felt less like entering an empty building and more like stepping into a paused life. I stood there quietly for almost a full minute before moving. "You really kept everything," I muttered softly. Outside wind brushed against the trees. Inside the cabin answered only with silence. I spent the first few hours cleaning, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. I opened windows to let stale air out, swept dead leaves off the porch, tossed spoiled canned food from the kitchen cabinets. Every room carried little pieces of my grandfather, folded wool blankets, neatly labeled tool drawers, coffee tins filled with screws and nails, a stack of old letters tied together with twine. That part hit me harder than I expected. Most of the envelopes came from veterans organizations, reunion invitations, military newsletters, thank you letters from other old servicemen. Many were unopened. Not because Grandpa didn't care. I think he simply stopped believing his own life mattered enough to revisit. Late that afternoon, I found an old photograph tucked inside a Bible near the bedroom. 3 young soldiers stood together in winter uniforms somewhere overseas. One of them was Grandpa Walter. I barely recognized him. Young, sharp jaw, confident eyes, and unlike the quiet old man I knew, this version of him looked dangerous. On the back, somebody had written in faded ink, "Chosin Reservoir 1951. Underneath that, "Not all heroes came home." I stared at the photograph a long time. Growing up, my grandfather never talked about Korea. Not once. If anybody asked, he'd usually say something simple like, "Cold place," then he'd change the subject. That silence suddenly felt heavier now. Toward evening, I built a small fire in the stone fireplace. Rain tapped softly against the roof while flames cracked through dry cedar logs. For the first time since the funeral, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I sat in Grandpa's recliner holding a cup of coffee and listening to the cabin settle around me. That's when I noticed the scratches. At first, I thought they were marks from moving furniture. But the grooves along the wooden floor near the fireplace looked too deliberate. Long scrape marks, repeated, like something heavy had been dragged back and forth many times. I leaned forward slowly. What the hell? The cast iron stove beside the fireplace looked older than the rest of the room. Massive thing, probably weighed 400 pounds. And suddenly I realized something strange. The scrape marks stopped directly beneath it. My pulse quickened. I set the coffee down and crouched beside the stove. Dust coated everything except one small metal edge near the floor. Recently touched. I reached down carefully and felt a hidden iron latch. For a second, I actually hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave it alone. Whatever Grandpa hid here had stayed hidden for decades. Maybe some secrets were supposed to stay buried. Then I remembered my father talking about selling this place before Grandpa was even cold in the ground. That thought hardened me again. I pulled the latch. A dull metallic click echoed beneath the floorboards. Then, slowly, part of the stone wall shifted inward. My stomach dropped. Behind the fireplace was a narrow, hidden doorway descending into darkness. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the smell of earth metal and something old. Very old. I grabbed the flashlight from my truck and stood at the top of the hidden stairs for nearly a full minute listening to my own heartbeat. Jesus Christ, Grandpa. The steps creaked beneath my boots as I descended. The underground room wasn't large. Maybe 12 feet across. Concrete walls. Low ceiling. No windows. But the moment my flashlight swept across the room, I knew this wasn't some old storage cellar. Military crates lined one wall. Real military crates. Stamped markings. Government labels. Dates from the early 1950s. A steel cabinet stood locked in the corner beside several oilskin-wrapped bundles. Maps covered part of a wooden table. Korean maps. Military coordinates. Handwritten notes. My breathing grew shallow. None of this made sense. My grandfather had spent 30 years working at a hardware store in Pennsylvania. How did a man like that end up hiding classified military materials beneath a cabin in West Virginia? Then my flashlight landed on something sitting alone atop the desk. A small cassette recorder. Beside it rested one carefully labeled tape. Written in Grandpa's handwriting were 5 simple words. For my grandson only. My hands actually shook as I inserted the cassette. For several seconds, static crackled softly through the tiny speaker. Then I heard his voice. Not the weak voice from the nursing home. A younger voice. Stronger. Steadier. "Danny, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone." The room suddenly felt colder. And deep in my gut, I realized my grandfather had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "Danny, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone." The cassette hissed softly between words. I sat frozen in that underground room beneath the cabin while my grandfather's voice echoed through the darkness like somebody speaking from another lifetime. Outside wind rattled branches against the roof overhead. "I suppose that means Richard didn't come," Grandpa continued quietly. He let out a tired little breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "No, I don't imagine he would." I swallowed hard. Even now after death, he still sounded more disappointed than angry. The tape clicked briefly. Then his tone changed. More serious. "What you're about to learn has been buried a very long time. Some men wanted it buried because they were ashamed. Others buried it because they were afraid." I looked around the hidden room again. Military crates, maps, government markings. Fear suddenly crept into me for the first time. Not curiosity anymore. Fear. "I never told you these things because I wanted you to have a peaceful life," Grandpa said. "But peace built on lies doesn't stay peaceful forever." The tape ended abruptly. Just like that. No explanation. No details. Only silence. I sat there staring at the cassette recorder while cold air pressed around me. Then slowly I stood and began opening the crates. Inside the first one were stacks of military folders wrapped carefully in waxed paper. Official reports. Mission summaries. Names blacked out in heavy ink. Most were stamped. Classified. Some pages had obviously been damaged by age and moisture, but enough remained readable to make my pulse race. Again and again I saw references to January 1951. Northern Korea. Emergency extraction operation. Casualty suppression. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Unauthorized recovery mission. I didn't fully understand any of it yet. But one thing became painfully clear. My grandfather had not been an ordinary infantryman. Near the back of the room stood a steel filing cabinet locked with a rusted padlock. I used an old hammer from upstairs to break it open. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes arranged neatly by date. And photographs. Dear God, the photographs. Snow-covered mountains. Young soldiers carrying wounded men through blizzards. Burned vehicles abandoned beside frozen roads. One picture showed several exhausted Marines standing near makeshift stretchers. In the center stood my grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him, holding a rifle, eyes hollow from exhaustion. On the back, someone had written, "Hell itself froze over here." I sank into the old wooden chair beside the desk. For most of my life, Grandpa Walter had seemed almost invisible to the world. Now, pieces of another man were emerging from the dark right in front of me. A man nobody had ever told me about. I listened to another tape. This one was different. Not a private message. More like a recorded testimony. "My name is Walter Harper," Grandpa said firmly. "Corporal, United States Army. Attached temporary support detail during the Chosin operation." A long pause followed. Then, "This statement is being recorded in case the truth never reaches the families." I felt chills crawl up my arms. He began describing the winter of 1950 during the Korean War. Temperatures dropping 30 below zero. Frostbite. Starvation. Chinese forces surrounding American troops. Men freezing to death in foxholes before sunrise. I'd studied some of it in school decades earlier, but hearing it from my grandfather's own voice made it feel horrifyingly real. Then he finally described the mission. An American convoy carrying wounded soldiers had been caught during a retreat near the Chosin Reservoir. Command ordered evacuation of surviving personnel only. Too many enemy forces. Too dangerous to return. But according to Grandpa, several wounded men had been left behind alive. One of them happened to be the son of a powerful United States senator. For a moment, the tape crackled with silence. Then Grandpa spoke more quietly. Command wanted the situation buried fast. Couldn't risk word spreading that Americans were abandoned. I leaned forward. "But we knew those boys were still alive," he continued. "We heard their radio calls ourselves." My chest tightened. Grandpa explained that official orders prohibited any rescue attempt. Too risky. Too costly. Mission over. Move south. Forget the dead. But 3 soldiers refused. Walter Harper, a Marine named Frank Delaney, and another soldier called Eddie Blackburn. Against direct orders, they returned into enemy territory during a blizzard to retrieve the wounded men. Listening to it, I could almost see them. 3 exhausted young Americans dragging themselves through snow and darkness because they couldn't live with leaving others behind. Grandpa's voice shook slightly as he described reaching the trapped soldiers. "They were freezing," he whispered, barely conscious. Some crying for their mothers. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, only static played through the recorder. Then came the line that stayed with me forever. "We brought back who we could. Not all. Who we could." The rescue succeeded partially. Several wounded men survived, including the senator's son. But 2 rescuers died during extraction. Frank Delaney froze to death after giving his coat to another soldier. Eddie Blackburn was shot covering their retreat. Grandpa survived, and because he survived, he carried the weight of it the rest of his life. The tape continued. When we returned, command ordered silence, said the mission never happened, said the country needed heroes, not scandals. I clenched my jaw listening. Those men risked everything to save abandoned Americans, and instead of honor, they were erased. Another tape revealed even more. The rescued senator's son eventually became a powerful federal judge. The military buried records to protect reputations. Families of the dead rescuers were told incomplete stories. No medals, no recognition, nothing, just silence. I suddenly understood why Grandpa spent his life so quietly. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. He was exhausted from carrying it alone. Hours passed without me realizing it. Rain hammered the cabin roof overhead while I sorted documents across the underground table. Then I found something that changed everything again. A sealed envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. The date was from 1998. My hands tightened opening it. Inside was a short typed letter. "Dad, if you move forward with this, people far more powerful than either of us will get involved. Let it die peacefully. You cannot help those families anymore. You will only destroy what's left of this family. Richard." I stared at the page. My father knew. Not recently. Not accidentally. He had known for decades. Suddenly, dozens of old memories shifted inside my head. The arguments between Dad and Grandpa during holidays. The years they barely spoke. The tension nobody explained. This wasn't ordinary family resentment. My father had actively tried to stop him. A terrible sickness settled in my stomach. Had they abandoned Grandpa because they were embarrassed? Or because they were afraid of what he might reveal? I rubbed both hands across my face and looked around the hidden room again. All those years in the nursing home. All those lonely Sundays. And beneath this cabin sat enough evidence to shake powerful people. I finally understood what Grandpa meant. Don't let them find it first. Because somebody else already knew it was here. And suddenly, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, I realized I might not be alone anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak in the cabin sounded different after discovering the hidden room. The mountains outside no longer felt peaceful. They felt watchful. Around midnight, I locked every door and pulled the curtains shut before returning underground with another lantern and a legal pad. I needed to organize what I'd found. Needed to think clearly. But the deeper I dug through Grandpa's files, the worse my stomach felt. There were military maps marked with handwritten coordinates. Private correspondence between officers. Names crossed out. References to sealed congressional inquiries. And over again, mentions of powerful people who wanted the rescue operation forgotten permanently. At nearly 2 a.m, I found another cassette labeled, "Richard, if you ever decide to do the right thing." My father's name. I slid the tape into the recorder. For several seconds, only static played. Then Grandpa spoke. "Son, if you're hearing this, maybe there's still hope for you." I actually felt anger rise hearing how gentle his voice sounded. After everything my father had done, Grandpa still spoke to him with kindness. "You were a good boy once," Grandpa continued softly, "before ambition got inside you." I leaned back slowly in the chair. "When those men died in Korea, I promised their families the truth would come someday. Not for revenge, not for politics, just dignity." The tape crackled. "You told me exposing the records would ruin careers." Maybe it would. But those boys already lost their lives. Their mothers lost sons. Their wives lost husbands. Somebody had to carry the truth for them. Then came a long silence. When Grandpa spoke again, his voice sounded tired beyond words. "But you were afraid." The tape clicked off. I stared into the darkness for a long time afterward. Not once in my entire life had my father ever talked about fear. Richard Harper projected confidence the way politicians do. Expensive suits, firm handshakes, country club voice. But now I could finally see it underneath. Fear. Not fear of Grandpa. Fear of consequences. Around sunrise, I drove into town to buy supplies. The nearest place was a small hardware and grocery store 20 minutes away, the kind with mounted deer heads on the wall and locals who still nodded hello to strangers. An elderly cashier glanced at the address on my receipt. "You staying up at Walter Harper's place?" she asked. I blinked. "You knew my grandfather." "Everybody around here knew Walter," she smiled sadly. "Quiet man, helped folks without asking for anything back." That sounded exactly like him. As she bagged my groceries, she lowered her voice slightly. "Couple men came looking for him few weeks ago." My chest tightened immediately. "What kind of men?" She shrugged. "City types, expensive coats, asked strange questions." A cold feeling spread through me. When was this? Not long before he passed. I thanked her and left quickly. The entire drive back to the cabin, my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Somebody had already been searching, which meant Grandpa knew time was running out. Back at the cabin, I decided to confront my father directly. I called him around noon. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Daniel?" No warmth, no grief, just irritation. "We need to talk," I said. A pause. "About what?" "About Grandpa." Another pause. Then colder. "What about him?" I took a slow breath. I found the hidden room. Silence. Not confused silence. Not surprised silence. Guilty silence. My heart started pounding. Finally, Dad spoke again, voice lower now. "You need to leave that place immediately." There it was. No denial. No questions. He already knew. I found the records. I continued carefully, the tapes, everything. "Daniel," he snapped, "you have absolutely no idea what you're interfering with. You knew the whole time." His breathing grew heavier through the phone. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Your grandfather destroyed his own life chasing ghosts." Ghosts. That's what he called dead soldiers. Something inside me turned hard as stone. "He spent his final years alone," I said quietly. "Did you ever even visit him once?" Dad ignored the question. "Listen carefully to me," he said. Pack whatever you found and give it to me. Today. Why? Because there are people connected to this who will not tolerate exposure. My stomach dropped. That wasn't concern. That was a warning. Who I demanded. But he'd already said too much. You think the government buried these records for 70 years by accident. His voice sharpened. You think powerful families just forget things like this. I suddenly remembered the letter from 1998. You will only destroy what's left of this family. This had never ended. Not really. Did you abandon Grandpa to protect yourself? I asked quietly. Dad exploded. You don't know what that man almost caused. His voice echoed so loudly through the phone, I had to pull it slightly away from my ear. He wanted hearings reopened, media involved, lawsuits, senators dragged through the mud, men with influence, men who built this country. I laughed bitterly. Built it on lies. You naive fool, he hissed. The world survives on buried truths. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that truly mattered. Did Grandpa ever stop trying? Silence again. And in that silence, I got my answer. No, Dad admitted finally. He wouldn't let it go. That explained everything. The nursing home. The isolation. The distance. They didn't merely abandon him because he was old. They needed him dismissed. Powerless. Forgettable. An old veteran nobody would listen to anymore. I felt physically sick realizing it. My own parents had spent years quietly erasing him. And despite all of it, Grandpa still left the truth to me instead of destroying the family himself. Dad's voice softened suddenly, almost pleading now. Daniel, listen to me carefully. Put everything back where you found it. Walk away. Outside, wind moved softly through the pine trees. I looked around Grandpa's cabin. The fishing gear. The old photographs. The life of a man who carried unbearable things without asking anyone for pity. Then I thought about those lonely Sundays by the nursing home window, waiting for a son who never came. No, I said quietly. Dad exhaled sharply. You'll regret this. No, I answered again. I think you already do. Then I hung up. For a long moment I stood completely still holding the phone in my hand. I'd spent most of my life avoiding conflict. Working ordinary jobs. Paying bills. Keeping peace inside the family. But standing there in that little mountain cabin, I finally understood something about revenge. Real revenge isn't screaming. It isn't violence. It's refusing to keep carrying somebody else's lie. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to fight my father. The first veteran who called me cried before he could finish introducing himself. My name's Harold Delaney, the old man said through a shaky voice. Frank Delaney was my brother. I sat at the cabin table, gripping the phone tighter. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, almost embarrassed by his own emotion, he asked, Is it true? Outside the cabin, window snow drifted softly through the mountains. Winter had finally arrived in full. I looked down at the photographs spread across Grandpa's table. Frank Delaney standing beside Walter in Korea. Young, smiling, alive. Yes, I answered softly, it's true. The old man broke down completely after that. Not loud sobbing. The kind older men do when they've spent 60 years holding something inside and finally can't anymore. My mother waited her whole life, he whispered. Whole damn life thinking Frankie died abandoned in the snow. I closed my eyes. That one sentence alone made every risk worth it. After my argument with Dad, I stopped trying to protect the family name. I contacted a military historian first, then a retired journalist from Pittsburgh who specialized in forgotten veterans' stories. At first, nobody believed me. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. An aging son claiming he discovered hidden Korean War documents beneath a mountain cabin sounded insane. But once they saw the evidence, everything changed. The historian nearly stopped breathing when I showed him the military files. These records were supposed to be sealed permanently, he muttered. The journalist asked only one question. Do you understand how big this could become? I thought about Grandpa sitting alone by the nursing home window. Yes, I answered quietly, I do. Within 2 weeks, reporters started calling constantly. Then veteran organizations. Then families. People who had spent decades believing incomplete stories suddenly realized somebody finally possessed the missing truth. And with every phone call, my anger shifted into something else. Responsibility. One snowy afternoon, I drove to Ohio to meet Harold Delaney in person. He lived alone in a small brick house filled with photographs and military memorabilia. He moved slowly with a cane, but his handshake still felt strong. The moment he saw the photograph of his brother Frank beside Grandpa Walter, tears filled his eyes immediately. "That idiot," he whispered affectionately, always trying to save everybody. We sat at his kitchen table for nearly 3 hours drinking weak coffee while he told me about Frank, how he loved baseball, how he played harmonica, how he enlisted at 19 because he thought it was the honorable thing to do. Then Harold looked at me quietly. "Your grandfather carried this all alone." I nodded. The old man stared toward the window for a long time before speaking again. "That's too heavy for one man." I think that was the moment I fully understood Grandpa's life. Not just the loneliness, the burden. Every family I contacted carried the same wound. Unanswered questions, incomplete stories, missing pieces, and all those years Walter Harper had been trying to give those families peace while powerful men worked to keep the truth buried. The first article ran 3 days before Christmas. Forgotten Korean War rescue may have been covered up for decades. By morning, every major news station in Pittsburgh had picked it up. Then national outlets followed. Suddenly, reporters crowded outside my apartment. Veteran groups demanded military review hearings. Families of dead servicemen began appearing on television holding faded photographs of young soldiers lost in Korea. And right in the middle of it all stood my father. At first, Dad denied everything publicly. These are exaggerated claims based on incomplete wartime records he told one local station. But the more evidence emerged, the worse things became for him, especially after journalists uncovered his long professional relationship with the late senator's family. That connection changed everything. Now it wasn't merely a forgotten war story. It looked like a 70-year political cover-up. One evening, I watched my father on television defending himself outside his law office. He looked older suddenly, smaller. The confidence he'd worn my whole life was cracking under pressure. "Mr. Harper," one reporter shouted, "did your family intentionally silence Walter Harper?" No, Dad snapped immediately. Another reporter stepped forward. "Then why did you prevent him from speaking publicly in the 90s? Dad froze. Only for half a second, but long enough. That clip spread everywhere. For the first time in his life, Richard Harper looked afraid in public. My mother called me later that night crying. "You're destroying this family," she whispered. I almost laughed hearing it. Destroying. Number. The family was already destroyed the day they abandoned Grandpa in that nursing home. I didn't say that out loud, though. At my age, anger feels different than it did when I was young. Quieter. Heavier. "I'm not trying to destroy anybody," I told her calmly. "I'm trying to finish what Grandpa started." She cried harder after that. Part of me felt guilty. Another part remembered 70 years of silence. A few weeks later, the Army officially announced a review of the classified records. That's when everything truly exploded. More veterans came forward. One retired Marine in Arizona provided letters mentioning Walter's unauthorized rescue operation. Another surviving radio operator confirmed hearing desperate calls from stranded soldiers during the blizzard. The story was no longer deniable. And suddenly, Walter Harper, the quiet old man forgotten in a nursing home, became national news. The strangest part, Grandpa would have hated the attention. I knew that in my bones. He never wanted fame. Never wanted revenge. He only wanted the truth carried home to the families left behind. One snowy January morning, I visited the nursing home again. Not because I had to, because I needed to. The same nurse who'd cared for Grandpa recognized me immediately. "We saw him on television," she said softly. I looked confused. "Who?" "Your grandfather." She smiled gently. The veterans salute him now when his picture comes on. Something caught in my throat hearing that. The nurse walked me toward the window where Grandpa used to sit every Sunday waiting for family. "You know," she said quietly, "he never complained about them." Them. My parents. He just kept saying maybe next week. That nearly broke me. I stood there staring out at the snowy parking lot, imagining him waiting year after year for people who chose comfort over love. Then suddenly I understood something important. The real tragedy wasn't merely the war. It wasn't even the cover-up. It was what silence does to people over time. How it slowly teaches decent men they deserve to carry pain alone. That afternoon as I left the nursing home, several older veterans sitting near the entrance stopped me. One of them, a gray-haired Marine wearing a Korea veteran cap, stood slowly and saluted. Not me. My grandfather. And in that quiet moment, standing beneath the cold Pennsylvania sky, Walter Harper finally came home. The ceremony took place on a cold April morning at Arlington National Cemetery. I remember standing there beneath a pale gray sky, watching rows of white headstones stretch across the hills like silent witnesses. Bugles echoed softly through the wind. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder in pressed uniforms, despite aching knees and canes, and old wartime injuries they still carried 50, 60, 70 years later. And at the center of it all was my grandfather, Walter Harper, the quiet old man abandoned in a nursing home, the man my parents tried to erase, the man who spent most of his life believing the country had forgotten him. Now soldiers saluted his name before the entire nation. I stood near the front holding the folded program with trembling hands, while an army officer stepped toward the microphone. For extraordinary courage during the Korean War. The words washed over me slowly. Not because I wasn't listening, because part of me still couldn't believe any of this was real. A military honor guard carried Grandpa's photograph beside the podium. It was the same picture I'd found hidden in the cabin underground. Young Walter, winter uniform, sharp eyes staring into history. For decades, that photograph sat buried in darkness beneath a fireplace. Now cameras flashed around it. The officer continued reading the official statement. How Corporal Walter Harper voluntarily returned into hostile territory to recover wounded American servicemen. How multiple lives were saved. How acts of bravery had been omitted from official records. And finally, how this nation regrets the delay in recognizing that sacrifice. Regrets the delay. 70 years. Still, hearing it mattered. Beside me, Harold Delaney wiped tears from his cheeks openly. At his age, he no longer cared who saw him cry. Neither did I. When the medal presentation ended, several younger soldiers approached quietly asking about Grandpa. Not the scandal. Not the politics. Him. What kind of man he was. I thought about that for a moment before answering. He was the kind of man who carried painful things so other people wouldn't have to. One of the soldiers nodded slowly like he understood exactly what that meant. After the ceremony, reporters tried surrounding me again. But I was tired of cameras by then. Tired of headlines. Tired of watching people reduce 70 years of suffering into quick television segments between commercials. So I slipped away early and drove south toward West Virginia. Toward the cabin. The mountains were turning green again by the time I arrived. Dogwoods blooming. Creeks running high from spring rain. For the first time since Grandpa's death, the place felt peaceful again. Not haunted. Just quiet. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside slowly. The cabin still smelled like cedar wood and old coffee. Sunlight streamed softly through the windows. And suddenly I could almost imagine Grandpa sitting there again in his recliner listening to baseball on the radio. Not as a tragic old man. As himself. I spent several days cleaning and repairing the place properly. New roof panels. Fresh paint. Fixed porch steps. Nothing fancy. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted fancy. One afternoon, Harold Delaney visited carrying a tackle box and a 6-pack of cheap beer. We sat on the porch for hours talking about old-age war movies, arthritis, and how young people drive too fast nowadays. Ordinary conversation. Comforting conversation. At one point, Harold looked around the cabin quietly. "You selling it?" I shook my head. "Number." "What then?" I looked toward the trees for a long moment before answering. I think Grandpa would have wanted it used. That idea stayed with me. Used. Not hidden away. Not turned into vacation property for rich tourists from the city. Useful. By summer, I started working with a local veterans organization to convert the cabin into a small retreat for aging veterans who needed temporary housing or simply a quiet place to recover. Nothing huge. Just a peaceful refuge in the mountains. Fishing. Coffee. Silence. Dignity. The kind of place Grandpa himself would have loved. Volunteers came from all over. Retired carpenters. Church groups. Veterans. Even a few young college kids who said the story inspired them. Funny how truth spreads once fear stops choking it. My parents never fully recovered from the scandal. Dad's law firm lost clients. His reputation cracked permanently. We spoke only once after the Arlington ceremony. He called late at night. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then quietly, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard before, he asked, "Was he proud of me before all this?" The question caught me off guard. Not defensive. Not angry. Just broken. I thought about Grandpa waiting by that nursing home window every Sunday, still hoping his son would walk through the door. "Yes," I answered honestly, "I think he always wanted to be." Dad started crying softly after that. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious hearing it. That surprised me. For months, I'd imagined revenge would feel satisfying. But standing in the wreckage of everything, I finally understood something Grandpa probably learned long ago. Revenge doesn't heal people. Truth does. Truth gives pain somewhere to go. A few weeks later, I found myself alone in the hidden room beneath the fireplace one final time. Most of the documents had already been archived officially. The tapes copied and preserved. History finally carried into daylight where it belonged. Only one cassette remained on the desk. The private tape Grandpa made for me. I played it again. "Danny, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone." His voice filled the underground room softly. Near the end of the tape, there was a section I somehow missed the first time. Maybe because I wasn't ready to hear it yet. "A man's worth isn't measured by what he keeps," Grandpa said quietly. A pause followed. Then, "It's measured by what he's willing to carry for others." I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the old maps and faded photographs. All my life I thought strength meant winning, being respected, being successful. But Walter Harper taught me something different. Real strength is quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness. And sometimes it looks like an old man sitting alone by a nursing home window, still loving people who failed him. Before leaving the hidden room, I shut off the light and rested my hand against the doorway. "Rest easy, Grandpa," I whispered. Outside, evening sunlight spilled across the mountains in long golden bands. The wind moved gently through the pine trees. And for the first time in a very long while, everything felt still. If this story meant something to you, maybe share it with someone who still carries old wounds in silence. And if there's someone you've been meaning to call, forgive, or simply sit beside for a while, don't wait too long. Sometimes the people who say the least are carrying the most. "Don't expect a single dollar of this estate, you idiot. My lawyer's going to bury you in court." My father's voice slammed across the probate courtroom so hard that even the clerk behind the desk stopped typing. A few people gasped softly. Someone in the back muttered, "Jesus Christ." I didn't react. At 78 years old, Richard Carter still knew how to command a room. Thick silver hair, expensive gray suit, gold watch visible beneath his cuff. Even sitting down, he carried himself like a man who believed the world belonged to him. And for most of his life it had. 3 construction companies across coastal Georgia, commercial properties, rental homes, a marina outside Savannah. More money than anybody in our family ever thought possible back when my grandfather was fixing shrimp boats for cash. But money had changed my father. Or maybe it had simply revealed who he already was. The courtroom smelled faintly of old paper coffee and furniture polish. Ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. Outside the tall windows, rain tapped against the glass. My younger brother Daniel sat behind my father with his arms folded, pretending not to enjoy the humiliation. My sister Linda stared down at her lap, avoiding eye contact completely. I stood alone at the petitioner's table, just the way they wanted it. My father pointed at me with a trembling finger. "She abandoned this family 20 years ago," he snapped at the judge. "Now she shows up wanting a payout? Absolutely not." The judge, an older woman named Harriet Coleman, adjusted her glasses calmly. "Mr. Carter," she said, "you will lower your voice in my courtroom." My father leaned back, furious but silent. Beside him sat his attorney, Robert Hensley. The moment I saw him earlier that morning, I recognized him instantly, despite the extra wrinkles and thinning hair. Robert still had the same sharp jawline, same careful posture, same habit of folding his hands together before speaking. For the first 15 minutes of the hearing, he hadn't looked directly at me once. That told me everything. He already knew who I was. I slowly turned toward him now. "Robert," I said quietly. His eyes finally lifted. The room suddenly felt very small. "Do you remember me?" For a second, nobody moved. Then all the color drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly. "Wait," he whispered. My father frowned. Robert stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "you were Navy JAG." The courtroom went silent. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. My father looked between us, confused. What the hell is he talking about? I kept my eyes on Robert. The last time we'd seen each other was nearly 16 years earlier at a military legal conference in Norfolk, Virginia. Back then, I was Commander Evelyn Carter, U.S. Navy Judge, Advocate General's Corps. Robert had been a civilian consultant assisting an internal fraud investigation involving military contractors. A messy case. The kind powerful people wanted buried. I helped expose it anyway. Robert never forgot. Apparently neither had I. Judge Coleman leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hensley," she asked, "is there an issue?" Robert swallowed hard. "No, Your Honor," he said automatically. But his voice lacked confidence now. My father leaned closer to him. "You said this would be simple," he hissed under his breath. Robert didn't answer. That worried my father more than shouting ever could. I finally sat down, slowly smoothing the sleeve of my navy blue blazer. At 52, I had learned something important about conflict. The calmest person in the room usually holds the real power. My father had spent his entire life mistaking volume for strength. Judge Coleman reviewed several papers in front of her. This hearing concerns the Carter estate restructuring and the petition filed by Ms. Evelyn Carter, requesting review of recent asset transfers, she said evenly. Daniel scoffed loudly behind my father. Asset transfers, he muttered. Here we go. I ignored him. The truth was, I hadn't returned to Savannah for money. Not really. I came back because something smelled wrong. 3 weeks earlier, an old family friend named Margaret Lewis called me unexpectedly in Norfolk. Margaret had worked as my mother's church friend for over 30 years. She sounded nervous on the phone. Your father's changing everything, she'd whispered. Properties and accounts, signatures. Honey, I think somebody's taking advantage of him. At first, I almost ignored it. After 2 decades of distance, I'd built a peaceful life away from my family's chaos. I taught legal ethics seminars now. Quiet work, quiet home, quiet mornings drinking coffee near Chesapeake Bay. Then Margaret said something that changed everything. Your mother would have wanted you to look into this. That sentence stayed with me all night. My mother had been gone 11 years. Breast cancer. Fast and cruel. She was the only reason I ever came home after joining the Navy. And if I was being honest with myself, losing her was the moment I truly lost the rest of my family, too. Judge Coleman looked toward Robert again. Counselor, are you prepared to proceed? Robert blinked like he'd forgotten where he was. Yes, Your Honor. But he still couldn't look at me comfortably. My father noticed. I could see it in his face now. The confidence was slipping. Slowly. Quietly. Like sand beneath a collapsing foundation. Daniel suddenly leaned forward. This is ridiculous, he said. She disappears for 20 years and now suddenly she cares about Dad. I turned toward him calmly. You transferred 6 properties in 14 months, I said. Daniel's face tightened instantly. That's business. Into shell companies. So what? While Dad was under medical supervision. My father slammed his palm against the table. That's enough. Judge Coleman raised her voice sharply. One more outburst and I'll clear this courtroom. Silence returned. Robert rubbed his forehead. For the first time since I walked in that morning, he finally spoke directly to my father instead of around him. Richard, he said quietly, there are some things we may need to discuss privately. My father stared at him in disbelief. What things? Robert hesitated. That hesitation changed the entire room. Because powerful attorneys don't hesitate unless danger is real. My father's confidence began draining from his face the same way color had drained from Robert's earlier. I knew that look. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of losing control. Judge Coleman announced a short recess. The moment her gavel struck, conversations exploded across the courtroom. People whispered. Daniel stood abruptly. Linda still wouldn't look at me. My father grabbed Robert's arm aggressively. What's going on? He demanded. Robert glanced toward me one more time. Then he quietly said words that made my father go completely still. She's not here for the money. And suddenly, for the first time in 22 years, my father looked afraid of me. When the courtroom emptied for recess, I stepped into the hallway and stood beside one of the tall windows overlooking Reynolds Street. Rainwater slid slowly down the glass. Savannah always smelled the same after a storm. Wet pavement, salt air drifting in from the river, magnolia trees soaked dark beneath gray skies. For a moment, I forgot I was standing inside a courthouse preparing to fight my own family. Then I heard my father yelling down the hallway. She's bluffing, he snapped. That's all this is. Daniel answered in a lower voice I couldn't fully hear. Robert said nothing. That silence told me more than words ever could. I folded my hands together and looked outside. At my age, people expect anger to cool down with time. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it hardens instead. I hadn't spoken to my father for almost 4 years before Margaret called me. But the truth was, our real separation started much earlier. Long before lawyers, long before courtrooms. Back when I was 18 years old and foolish enough to believe my father might someday be proud of me. In 1992, our family lived in a large white house outside Savannah near the Wilmington River. Back then, my father was still building his business. He worked constantly. Construction contracts during the day, financial meetings at night, every conversation at the dinner table eventually turned into money growth expansion or loyalty. Especially loyalty. My father valued loyalty above almost everything else. You take care of family, he used to say. Family takes care of you. What he really meant was, do what I say. My brother Daniel loved that arrangement. He worshipped my father from childhood, followed him to job sites every weekend, learned equipment names before he learned algebra. Linda stayed quiet and agreeable. But I was different. I loved books, history, debate, structure, rules. And somewhere around 16 years old, I started realizing something dangerous. I didn't want my father's life. I wanted my own. The summer after graduation, I sat at our kitchen table staring at Navy recruitment papers, while my mother washed dishes quietly beside me. "You really want this?" she asked softly. "I do. You know your father's going to fight you." "I know." My mother dried her hand slowly. "She'd make a good officer," she murmured mostly to herself. I smiled. "You really think so?" She looked at me then with tired but gentle eyes. "Evelyn, you were never meant to stay small." That conversation stayed with me my entire life, especially after she died. My father came home an hour later carrying rolled blueprints beneath his arm. He immediately noticed the paperwork. "What's this?" I answered carefully. "I'm joining the Navy." The room went completely still. My father stared at me like I'd announced I was moving to the moon. "You're what?" "I already spoke with a recruiter." "You're not joining the military." "I already signed preliminary papers." His face turned red almost instantly. "For God's sake, Evelyn," why he demanded. "You're smart. You could go to law school here in Georgia. You could help build this family." "I don't want construction contracts." "You don't even know what you want." "Yes, I do." He laughed once cold and sharp. "The military," he said. "That's a waste of a smart woman." My mother quietly said, "Richard," but he ignored her. "You know what happens in the military," he continued. "People bark orders at you for 20 years, then throw you away." I looked him directly in the eye. At least I'd earned my place. The second those words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. My father stepped closer. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I don't want everything handed to me. I built this family from nothing. And now you think you own everybody in it." My mother whispered my name nervously, but neither of us stopped. My father pointed toward the door. "If you walk out of this house chasing some fantasy, don't expect to come crawling back later." I still remember the silence after that. The old kitchen clock ticking. The hum of the refrigerator. My mother quietly crying beside the sink. I left 3 weeks later. The morning I departed for training, my father didn't come outside to say goodbye. Only my mother did. She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "You call me whenever you can," she whispered. "I will." "And Evelyn?" "Yeah. Don't let hard people make you hard too." I nodded back then like I understood. Truthfully, I didn't. Not yet. The Navy changed me. Not in the dramatic Hollywood way people imagine. No heroic music, no perfect victories. Mostly it changed me slowly. Early mornings, long deployments, endless discipline, responsibility. I learned how to stay calm under pressure, how to speak carefully, how to read people before they spoke. Eventually, I attended law school through the military program and entered JAG. That was where I finally found purpose. Military law isn't glamorous work. Half the time you're dealing with exhausted young service members making terrible decisions far from home. The other half you're dealing with powerful people trying to protect themselves. I became good at seeing through lies. Maybe because I grew up around them. Over the years, I handled fraud investigations, misconduct hearings, and contract abuse cases involving military suppliers. That reputation spread. By my 40s, younger officers sought my advice regularly. Meanwhile, back home, my father told people I'd abandoned the family. Margaret once admitted church members whispered about me constantly. "Richard acts like you betrayed him personally," she'd told me years earlier. Maybe I had. Or maybe I simply refused to belong to him. I came home only once for longer than a weekend. My mother's funeral. I still remember standing beside her casket while rain hammered the church roof. My father never cried publicly. Not once. But after the service, when everybody else left, I found him alone in the fellowship hall, staring at one of her photographs. For a moment he looked very old, very tired. I almost walked over. Almost. Then he spoke without turning around. "You leaving broke her heart." The words hit harder than any scream ever could. I left the next morning before sunrise. And after that, years passed, quietly, until Margaret's phone call dragged me back to Savannah once again. Back to courtrooms. Back to old wounds. Back to my father. A soft voice interrupted my thoughts. "Commander Carter." I turned from the courthouse window. Robert Hensley stood several feet away holding a paper cup of coffee. He looked uneasy, older than before. "May I speak with you privately?" he asked. I studied him carefully, then nodded once, because something in his face told me the real fight hadn't even started yet. Robert led me into a small conference room at the end of the courthouse hallway. The room smelled faintly of dust and burnt coffee. One long wooden table sat beneath harsh fluorescent lights, and a faded American flag leaned awkwardly in the corner beside a filing cabinet. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Robert closed the door carefully behind him. Then he let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered, "this is one hell of a reunion." I stayed standing. "You look nervous." "That's because I am." He gave a tired little laugh and loosened his tie slightly. 16 years earlier, Robert Hensley had been one of the sharpest civilian attorneys I'd ever encountered. Confident, controlled, impossible to rattle. Now he looked like a man carrying something heavy. "You recognized me immediately this morning," I said. He nodded once. "The second you walked into the courtroom. And yet you still took my father's case." Robert rubbed his jaw. "I didn't know you were involved when I accepted it." I crossed my arms. "But now?" He hesitated. "That depends." "On what?" "Whether my instincts are right." Outside the room I could hear faint courthouse noises. Phones ringing, shoes against tile floors, somebody coughing somewhere down the hall. Real life continuing while families quietly tore themselves apart behind closed doors. Robert finally pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "You remember Norfolk?" he asked. "I remember the contractor fraud case." His expression darkened immediately. "That investigation destroyed careers." "No," I corrected calmly. "Corruption destroyed careers." He gave me a long look. "You always talked like that." "That's because I was usually right." A faint smile touched his face despite himself. There it was. Recognition. Respect. Maybe even fear. Not fear of me physically. Fear of what I represented. Truth. Robert leaned forward slightly. "When I saw your father's estate records last month," he said quietly, "something bothered me." I said nothing. He continued. "Large property transfers, sudden LLC formations, medical authorization changes, power of attorney revisions." My stomach tightened slightly. Exactly what Margaret warned me about. "How bad?" I asked. Robert lowered his voice further. "Bad enough that I started making copies." Now that surprised me. "Why?" "Because your brother Daniel pushes too hard." He paused. Men who are honest usually don't panic every time paperwork gets reviewed. I looked toward the door briefly before answering. "Daniel always wanted Dad's approval." Robert nodded. I noticed. There was another silence. Long. Measured. Finally, Robert said something unexpected. "You know, after Norfolk, people talked about you for years." I raised an eyebrow slightly. I'm sure not kindly. "Actually," he shook his head slowly, "most people respected you." That caught me off guard more than I wanted to admit. In military law, respect rarely comes directly. Usually it arrives disguised as caution. Robert looked down at his coffee cup. "You walked into rooms full of powerful men and never once acted intimidated." I was intimidated constantly. Could have fooled me. I almost smiled. Almost. He reached into his leather briefcase and slid a thin folder across the table toward me. "I probably shouldn't do this," he said quietly. I opened it carefully. Photocopies. Property deeds. Transfer records. Bank authorizations. And one signature page that immediately made my chest tighten. My father's signature looked shaky. Unnaturally shaky. I looked up slowly. When was this signed? 6 months ago. He was hospitalized 6 months ago. Robert nodded grimly. Exactly. I turned another page. One of the waterfront rental properties had been transferred into an LLC connected to Daniel. Another commercial property showed partial ownership reassigned to a woman named Teresa Molina. I frowned. "Who's Teresa Molina?" "Your father's in-home caregiver." That landed hard. I stared at him. "You're telling me my father transferred property ownership to his caregiver? 40% stake in one holding company. That makes no sense." "It gets worse." Robert slid another paper toward me. Medical scheduling records. Neurology appointments. Medication adjustments. Cognitive evaluations. I felt my heartbeat slow the way it always did before difficult legal confrontations. Cold. Focused. "How bad is his condition?" I asked quietly. Robert hesitated carefully this time. "Some days he's perfectly sharp," he admitted. "Other days?" He stopped. "Other days?" He forgets conversations. I looked down at the documents again. My father had always terrified people with his memory. Numbers, dates, contracts, debts from 30 years earlier. The idea of him forgetting things felt almost impossible. And suddenly, beneath all my anger, I felt something else. Sadness. Robert studied me carefully. "You still care about him?" I answered honestly. "I don't know." He nodded like that made perfect sense. At our age, emotions become less simple than younger people imagine. Love and resentment can live inside the same heart for decades. Robert leaned back in his chair. There's more. He reached into his briefcase again and removed a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. My breath caught instantly. I recognized the handwriting before he even handed it to me. My mother's. How did you get this? Margaret Lewis. Of course, Robert explained quietly. She gave it to me last week after she learned I represented your father. My fingers trembled slightly as I took the envelope. On the front, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words. For Evelyn if things go wrong. Suddenly, the room felt too small. Too warm. My mother had died 11 years earlier. And somehow, she had seen this coming. Robert stood slowly. I haven't read it, he said respectfully. I nodded without speaking. After a moment, he moved toward the door. Then he stopped beside it. There's something else you should know, he said. I looked up. I withdrew from representing your father 10 minutes ago. That surprised me again. Why? Robert opened the door halfway before answering. Because I've spent 30 years practicing law, he said quietly, and whenever decent people start hiding paperwork, he looked directly at me. Ugly truths usually follow. Then he left. I sat alone in the conference room holding my mother's letter while rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows. For several minutes I simply stared at the envelope. Part of me didn't want to open it. Because once you uncover the truth inside a family, you can never put it back again. Finally, slowly, I slid my finger beneath the seal. Inside was a single folded page. My mother's handwriting looked shaky but careful. I unfolded the paper, and the very first sentence made my stomach drop. If you are reading this, Evelyn, someone in this family has betrayed your father. I read my mother's letter 3 times before I could fully process it. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. Not because I was afraid, because hearing my mother's voice again, even through faded handwriting, felt like reopening a wound I had spent 11 years trying to survive. Her letter was short, very short, but every sentence carried weight. Richard trusts too easily when it comes to family, especially Daniel. Please don't let anger blind you, Evelyn. Your father has many faults, but he does love his children in the only way he knows how. And then the final line, watch the paperwork. That line stayed in my head long after I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my purse. Watch the paperwork. That was exactly what I intended to do. Court resumed briefly that afternoon, but Judge Coleman postponed the main hearing for another week after Robert officially withdrew from the case. The entire courtroom buzzed with speculation. My father looked furious. Daniel looked nervous. And nervous men make mistakes. As people filtered toward the exits, my father finally approached me directly for the first time all day. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for me to smell his cologne. The same brand he'd worn my entire life. You think you're clever? He asked quietly. His voice had changed. Less explosive now. More dangerous. I met his stare calmly. No, I said, I think something's wrong. There's nothing wrong except you coming back here stirring up trouble. You transferred property to a caregiver. His jaw tightened instantly. That was my decision. Was it? His eyes flashed with anger. Then, before he could answer, Daniel stepped between us. She's trying to manipulate you, he snapped at my father. That's what she does. I looked at my brother carefully. At 50 years old, Daniel still carried himself like a teenager desperate for approval. Expensive watch, expensive boots, permanent chip on his shoulder. Some people grow older without ever truly growing up. Daniel pointed toward me aggressively. You disappear for 20 years, and suddenly you care about Dad's finances. I care whether he understands what he's signing. He understands perfectly. Then why are you panicking? That hit him harder than I expected. His face reddened immediately. I'm not panicking. Really? Stop talking to me like I'm stupid. Then stop behaving like a guilty man. My father slammed his cane against the courthouse floor. That's enough. Several people turned to stare. My father lowered his voice again. You're embarrassing this family. I almost laughed at that. After everything that had happened, he still thought appearances mattered most. I looked directly at him. No, I said quietly. Somebody already did that. Then I walked away. That evening, Linda invited me to dinner at my father's house. The invitation surprised me. My sister and I had barely spoken in years. Still, I accepted. Partly because I needed answers. Partly because I wanted to see the house again before everything exploded completely. The Carter house looked smaller than I remembered. Age does that to childhood places. The white paint near the porch had started peeling. Several shutters hung crooked. The giant oak tree beside the driveway still stood tall, though now its branches sagged heavily with Spanish moss. I parked beside Daniel's truck. Of course he was already there. Inside, the house smelled like roast chicken coffee and old wood polish. Memory hit me hard the second I walked through the front door. For one dangerous moment, I almost expected my mother to appear from the kitchen drying her hands on a towel. Instead, Linda greeted me awkwardly. "You came. You invited me." She nodded nervously. Linda had always hated conflict. As children, she survived our family by staying invisible. We sat around the dining room table 30 minutes later. My father at the head, Daniel beside him, Linda across from me. The tension felt thick enough to touch. Nobody spoke much at first. Silverware scraped plates. Ice clinked softly inside water glasses. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "So what exactly do you want, Evelyn?" There it was, straight to the point. I set down my fork carefully. "The truth," he scoffed. "No, you want revenge." That too, I admitted calmly. Linda looked startled by my honesty. My father stared at me coldly. "You always thought you were better than this family." I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I just wanted a life that belonged to me." "You abandoned your mother." That landed like a punch. Even after all these years, he still knew exactly where to cut. I answered quietly. "I called her every week." "You left her here alone." "I left because staying here was suffocating me." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "There she goes, blaming Dad for everything." I ignored him and looked directly at my father. "Did you know Daniel transferred waterfront properties into shell companies?" The room froze instantly. Daniel slammed his hand onto the table. Jesus Christ. Linda looked between us anxiously. My father frowned. "What shell companies?" Daniel answered too quickly. "Tax planning." I watched my father carefully then. Really watched him. The confusion in his face looked genuine. Not staged. Not manipulated. Genuine. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. He truly might not know everything happening around him. Daniel kept talking rapidly. "It's standard business structuring. Ask any accountant." I looked at my father. "Did you personally review every transfer document?" "Yes." "When?" "What?" "The waterfront transfers. When did you review them?" My father hesitated. "Just briefly, but long enough." Daniel jumped in immediately. "Dad doesn't need to answer interrogations at dinner." I leaned forward slightly. "Why are you so afraid of questions?" "I'm sick of your attitude." "And I'm sick of lies." My father suddenly gripped the edge of the table hard. His breathing changed. Sharp. Uneven. Linda stood immediately. "Dad?" For one frightening moment I thought he might collapse. I moved beside him instinctively. "Old training. Old reflexes." "Slow breaths," I said calmly. Daniel grabbed my arm angrily. "Don't touch him." I pulled free instantly. "He needs to sit back." "Stay away from him." My father looked disoriented now. Sweat gathered near his forehead. Linda rushed for his medication while I steadied his chair carefully. "It's okay," I told him quietly. "Just breathe." For a moment. Just one moment. He looked at me not like an enemy, but like a tired old man. After several minutes, his breathing settled again. Nobody spoke. The room had changed. Completely. Then something happened none of us expected. From the hallway outside the dining room, we heard voices. Daniel's voice earlier that afternoon. Recorded. Muffled but clear enough. My father frowned. "What is that?" Linda looked confused. But I recognized the sound immediately. A phone recording. And then Daniel's recorded voice said words that turned the entire room cold. He barely remembers half the paperwork anyway. Silence. Absolute silence. Daniel went white. Slowly. My father turned toward him. And for the first time all evening, my brother looked afraid. The recording changed everything. Not loudly. Not dramatically. That's the strange thing about families falling apart. The worst moments often happen in complete silence. My father sat motionless at the dining room table, staring at Daniel like he didn't recognize him anymore. Linda looked close to tears. Daniel, meanwhile, shifted instantly into survival mode. "That recording's out of context," he snapped. "You don't even know what conversation that came from." I looked toward him calmly. "Then explain it." "I was talking about stress. Dad forgets things sometimes because he's overwhelmed." My father finally spoke. "You recorded me?" Daniel blinked rapidly. "No, Dad, listen. You recorded private conversations in my house." It wasn't like that. The anger in my father's face slowly faded into something worse. Disappointment. At his age, disappointment carries more weight than rage ever could. Linda quietly admitted the truth a few moments later. She had recorded the conversation accidentally while trying to save voicemail instructions from Daniel about caregiving schedules. The phone had remained recording in her purse. Nobody planned to hear Daniel say those words. Sometimes truth exposes itself without permission. Dinner ended shortly afterward. My father retreated upstairs without another word. Daniel stormed outside furious. Linda sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into space while I helped clear dishes in silence. Finally, she spoke softly. I think he's been controlling everything for years. I stopped drying a plate. You knew. I suspected. That's not the same thing. Tears filled her eyes immediately. You don't understand what it's like staying here, she whispered. Every day somebody's angry. Every day somebody's manipulating somebody else. I leaned against the counter quietly. Because honestly, I did understand. More than she realized. Linda looked at me carefully. Did you ever hate us for staying? The question caught me off guard. I answered honestly. Number. Then after a pause, I hated that nobody protected Mom. Linda broke down crying after that. Not loudly. Just years of exhaustion finally leaking out all at once. And for the first time in decades, I stopped seeing my sister as part of the problem. She was surviving it too. 3 days later, the final hearing began. Savannah Probate Court was more crowded this time. Word had spread. Family estate battles involving wealthy people always attracted attention in smaller southern cities, especially when rumors of fraud entered the picture. I arrived early wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying 2 organized binders beneath my arm. Old habits from Navy litigation days. Preparation calms nerves. My father entered 10 minutes later with a new attorney named Carl Whitmore. Whitmore looked aggressive in the way insecure lawyers often do. Loud voice, sharp movements, expensive cufflinks designed to impress people. He barely glanced at me before smirking confidently. That told me he underestimated me. A mistake many men made over the years. Daniel walked in behind them looking exhausted. He hadn't slept much. You could see it in his eyes. Good. Pressure reveals character. Judge Coleman entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everybody stood. The room settled quickly. Whitmore opened aggressively. Your Honor, this entire petition is built on emotional grievances rather than legal evidence. I sat quietly listening. He continued for nearly 20 minutes painting me as an estranged daughter returning home for financial gain after decades away. Classic strategy. Attack motives before facts emerge. Several times he referred to my military career dismissively. As admirable as service may be, he said once it has no relevance to estate administration. I almost smiled at that, because he had no idea how much my career prepared me for exactly this situation. When he finally finished, Judge Coleman looked toward me. Ms. Carter. I stood slowly. The courtroom became very quiet. At first I began calmly. I believed this hearing concerned inheritance fairness. I opened the first binder carefully. Now I believe it concerns exploitation. Daniel shifted immediately beside my father. I continued. Over the last 14 months, 6 properties belonging to Richard Carter were transferred into holding companies connected directly or indirectly to Daniel Carter. Whitmore interrupted instantly. Standard asset management. I slid documents toward the clerk. Alongside these transfers came revised medical authorizations signed during periods of documented cognitive evaluation. That got Judge Coleman's attention. Whitmore objected again. I remained calm. Your Honor, I also submit financial records showing caregiver compensation exceeding legally documented agreements by nearly $200,000. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Daniel whispered something angrily to Whitmore. Judge Coleman reviewed several pages carefully. Then she looked toward my father. Mr. Carter, were you aware of these transactions in detail? My father opened his mouth, paused, then slowly said, I believed I was. The room shifted instantly. Not legally, emotionally. People could feel it. A powerful old man suddenly sounding uncertain. Whitmore stepped in quickly. My client trusted his son with administrative responsibilities. That does not constitute fraud. No, I agreed quietly, but forged signatures might. Daniel shot to his feet. That's bullshit. Judge Coleman slammed her gavel. Sit down immediately. I handed another document forward. Handwriting analysis. Signature comparisons. Transfer inconsistencies. Whitmore's confidence visibly weakened as he flipped through pages faster and faster. Then came the final blow. Teresa Molina, my father's caregiver. She entered nervously and took the witness stand. At first she tried protecting Daniel. You could tell. Short answers, avoiding eye contact. Then I asked one simple question. Ms. Molina, who instructed you to bring documents to Mr. Carter during medication hours. Silence. Whitmore objected again. Judge Coleman overruled him. Teresa looked down at her hands. Finally, she whispered. Daniel did. The courtroom erupted into noise. Judge Coleman called repeatedly for order. Daniel stood again, furious. She's lying. I turned toward him calmly. No, I said softly. You just never thought I'd come back. That line hit harder than shouting ever could. Daniel's face twisted with panic now. Real panic. Not anger anymore. Fear. Pure fear. My father stared at him in disbelief. And suddenly I saw something heartbreaking. Richard Carter, the man who dominated every room his entire life, finally realizing his own son had manipulated him. Not for weeks. For years. Judge Coleman reviewed the final evidence silently. Then I removed one last item from my binder. My mother's letter. I would like permission to read a statement written by Eleanor Carter before her death, Whitmore objected weakly. Judge Coleman allowed it. My hand stayed steady as I unfolded the paper. But my voice nearly broke anyway, because hearing my mother again after all these years still hurt. I read slowly. Richard trusts family more than he trusts himself now. Please protect him from anyone who mistakes his love for weakness. The courtroom went completely silent. My father lowered his head, and to my shock, I saw tears falling onto his hands. After the hearing ended, nobody spoke to each other right away. The courtroom emptied slowly beneath low murmurs and uncomfortable silence. Judge Coleman ordered a temporary freeze on all disputed estate transfers pending a formal investigation. Daniel's attorney requested additional time. Teresa Molina left crying. Reporters near the courthouse entrance waited hopefully for drama that never came. At our age, public scenes become exhausting. Nobody wins them. My father remained seated long after everyone else stood. He looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Spiritually. Like a man finally seeing the full cost of his own blindness. Daniel tried approaching him once outside the courtroom. Dad, listen to me. Not now. That was all my father said. But the coldness in his voice stunned even Daniel. For most of our lives, my brother had survived on our father's approval the way some people survive on oxygen. And now suddenly, that approval was gone. Daniel looked toward me with open hatred. This is what you wanted. No, I answered quietly. This is what you created. He shook his head bitterly. You always thought you were better than us. I almost responded. Almost defended myself. But after 52 years, I'd learned something important. People only hear truth when they're ready for it. And Daniel wasn't ready. Not yet. He walked away without another word. I watched him disappear into the rain outside the courthouse shoulders, tense hands shoved into his coat pockets, like an angry little boy pretending to be a man. Then Linda approached me carefully. Dad wants to see you tonight. I looked at her. Alone. That evening I drove back to the family house just after sunset. The rain had finally stopped. Wet streets reflected yellow porch lights and passing headlights across quiet Savannah neighborhoods. Everything looked softer after rain, even painful places. My father sat alone on the back porch when I arrived. One lamp glowed beside him near an untouched glass of iced tea. The old wooden swing creaked gently beneath his weight. For a second, seeing him there reminded me painfully of childhood summers when he still laughed easily, before money hardened him, before pride swallowed everything. He didn't look up immediately when I stepped outside. You still walk quietly, he said. Military habit. I sat across from him without speaking. Crickets hummed softly in the darkness beyond the yard. Finally, he exhaled heavily. I should have listened to your mother more. That sentence alone shocked me. My father almost never admitted mistakes. Not small ones. Certainly not life-sized ones. I stayed quiet, letting him speak at his own pace. Old men who spent decades controlling conversations don't surrender words easily. After a while, he rubbed his hands together slowly. You know what the worst part is, he asked. What? I think some part of me already knew. His voice sounded tired. Not angry anymore, just tired. I knew Daniel pushed too hard, he admitted. I knew things felt off sometimes. He swallowed hard. But admitting that would have meant admitting I was getting weak. You're getting older, I said gently. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed quietly, it isn't. He stared out toward the dark backyard. When your mother got sick, he paused. I spent every day terrified. That caught me off guard. My father never spoke openly about fear. I thought if I controlled everything tightly enough, he continued, maybe I could stop life from falling apart. His eyes finally met mine. But life falls apart anyway. There it was. The truth beneath all his anger all these years. Fear. Not hatred. Fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of losing family. Fear of becoming unnecessary. I leaned back slowly in my chair. For what it's worth, I said, Mom never blamed you. His face tightened painfully. I blamed myself enough for both of us. Silence settled again. Soft. Heavy. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked in the distance. Then my father surprised me again. I was proud of you, he said quietly. I looked at him carefully. What? The Navy. He gave a weak shake of his head. I just didn't know how to say it. 22 years. 22 years I'd waited to hear those words. And somehow now that they finally arrived, they didn't feel victorious. Just sad. My father rubbed his eyes tiredly. When people in town talked about you, he admitted I always pretended not to care. He gave a faint, bitter smile. But every time somebody mentioned Commander Carter, he paused. I listened. Emotion rose unexpectedly inside my chest. Not anger. Not revenge. Grief. Grief for all the years pride stole from both of us. You hurt, Mom, I said quietly. His eyes lowered immediately. I know. You hurt me too. I know that too. For a long moment, neither of us spoke again. Then he asked softly, Why'd you really come back, Evelyn? The honest answer surprised even me. Because somebody had to protect you. His face crumpled slightly after that. Not dramatically. Just enough. Age strips performance away from people eventually. What remains is usually the truth. I spent my whole life respecting strength, he murmured. But I never respected yours properly. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I held them back. Military training never fully leaves you. My father glanced toward the dark house behind us. Tomorrow I'm changing the estate again. You don't need to explain that to me. Yes, I do. He looked directly at me. I built this family around money because I thought money kept people together. His voice weakened. Turns out it just gave us more ways to hurt each other. That sentence stayed with me because it was true. I had seen wealthy families destroy themselves over inheritance, and poor families survive beautifully with almost nothing. Money never creates character. It only exposes it. My father straightened slowly. The house on Tybee Island, he said. Your mother wanted you to have it someday. I shook my head immediately. I don't need most of this. What do you want? I thought about it honestly. Not the money. Not the victory. Not even revenge anymore. Finally, I answered. Mom's letters. His eyes softened. That's all. And the truth. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, he asked the saddest question I'd ever heard him say. Do you think it's too late for this family? I looked at the old man sitting across from me. A man who had spent decades believing control was the same thing as love. And for the first time in my life, I saw him clearly. Not as a tyrant. Not as a villain. Just as a flawed father who ran out of time before he learned how to say the right things. I answered honestly. No, I said quietly. But it's late. My father died 8 months later. Peacefully. That still surprises me when I say it out loud. For most of my life, I assumed Richard Carter would leave this world the same way he lived in it, fighting, shouting, refusing to let go of anything. Instead, he died quietly in his sleep one cold February morning while rain moved across the Georgia coast. Linda found him first. She called me at 6:30. I remember sitting beside my kitchen window in Norfolk holding the phone while dawn slowly brightened the sky outside. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Linda whispered, I think he finally got tired. And somehow, that felt true. The months after the court hearing changed all of us. Not instantly. Real healing never happens instantly. Television stories like pretending families reconcile after one emotional speech. Real life is slower. Messieurs. People backslide. Old resentments return unexpectedly. Trust rebuilds inch by inch. Daniel struggled the most. Once the financial investigation fully exposed the property manipulations, he avoided most of the family for weeks. The state never filed criminal charges because my father refused to pursue them. That decision angered me at first, until my father explained why. He's still my son, he said quietly. I didn't fully agree, but I understood. That's the difficult thing about parenthood, I suppose. Love survives even when trust doesn't. Eventually, Daniel entered counseling for gambling addiction and financial dependency issues. That revelation explained more than I expected. The debt, the desperation, the constant hunger for quick money. Pain travels through families in strange disguises sometimes. Linda began visiting me more often after the funeral. At first, our conversations stayed careful and polite, like two strangers sharing a waiting room. Then slowly, we remembered how to be sisters again. One afternoon, she admitted something painful while helping me unpack old boxes from my mother's attic storage. "You know," she said softly, "I used to envy you." I looked up from a stack of photo albums. "Me, you left." Those two words broke my heart more than she realized, because leaving never felt brave while I was doing it. Mostly it felt lonely. I spent years eating dinner alone in military apartments, wondering whether independence was worth the cost. But hearing Linda say that made me realize something important. Sometimes staying hurts people too. 3 months after my father's funeral, I moved temporarily into my mother's old Tybee Island house. Small place, nothing fancy. White siding, blue shutters, wrap-around porch facing the marsh grass. The floorboards creaked. The plumbing complained constantly. And I loved it immediately. My mother planted hydrangeas along the front walk years earlier. Somehow they still bloomed every spring despite neglect. I spent weeks restoring the house slowly, painting walls, cleaning closets, sorting through decades of memories nobody touched after her death. There's something strangely sacred about handling objects that belonged to someone you loved deeply. Every handwritten grocery list, every recipe card, every old church bulletin folded inside drawers. Tiny proof a person existed. One rainy afternoon I found the final letter. It had slipped behind a dresser drawer in my mother's bedroom. The envelope simply said, "For my girls." I sat on the bedroom floor for nearly 10 minutes before opening it. Outside rain tapped softly against the windows, just like the day of the courtroom hearing. Funny how life circles back sometimes. My mother's handwriting looked weaker than before. This letter had clearly been written near the end of her illness. I read slowly. Families don't collapse because of money. They collapse because people stop listening to one another. Your father spent his whole life trying to protect everybody. He just forgot that love cannot survive without gentleness. Please forgive each other where you can. Life becomes very short very quickly. By the time I reached the end, tears blurred the words completely. I cried harder than I had at her funeral. Not because of grief alone, because for the first time in decades, everything finally felt honest. No courtroom, no screaming, no pretending. Just truth, simple and painful. That evening, I carried one of the old porch chairs outside and sat watching sunset spread across the marsh. The sky turned orange and gold over the water. Somewhere nearby, children laughed while riding bicycles down the street. Ordinary life. Quiet life. The kind I used to think I wanted away from my family. Now I understood something differently. Peace doesn't come from escaping your past completely. It comes from finally facing it honestly. I thought about my father often after his death. Not the angry version from the courtroom. Not the towering businessman everybody feared. But the tired old man sitting on the porch, admitting he spent his life misunderstanding strength. And strangely enough, I forgave him. Not because he deserved perfection, but because none of us ever truly become the parents, children, or people we imagined we would be. We just try. And sometimes if we're lucky, we get one final chance to say what should have been said years earlier. Before time runs out, I still keep my mother's letters in the living room drawer beside my favorite chair. Some evenings I reread them while listening to rain move across the coast. And every time I remember the lesson this whole painful journey taught me, money reveals people, but forgiveness restores them. If this story touched you in some way, if it reminded you of someone you lost, someone you still need to forgive, or maybe someone you should call before it's too late, I hope you'll carry that feeling with you tonight. And if you believe stories like this matter, stories about family, regret, truth, and second chances, then stay with us for the next one. Because sometimes hearing another person's story helps us heal parts of our own. The room went so quiet I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the Carlisle dining room. 20 years of Navy discipline had trained me to notice silence. Real silence. The kind that presses against your skin and tells you something has shifted. My fiancé's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. His younger brother Julian stared at me like I'd just stood up and recited state secrets. Across the polished mahogany table, Eleanor Carlisle slowly lowered her fork onto her china plate with the kind of precision only old money women seem to master. And Ethan? Ethan looked at me the way men look at a locked door they were certain would open. A moment earlier he'd leaned toward Julian with that smug little half-smile of his and murmured in Latin, "Non intelligis, tantum ridea et annua." She has no clue, just smile and nod. The table had chuckled softly. I had smiled politely. Then I'd lifted my crystal glass, met Ethan's eyes, and answered in the same measured Latin my Georgetown professor once called better than his own. Intellego satis, etiam superbiam tuum. I understand enough, including your arrogance. That was the moment his family froze. And that was the moment I finally understood I was not going to marry Ethan Carlisle. 3 hours earlier, I had believed I was driving toward my future. The late October sun had cast long amber streaks across Route 50 as I headed toward Annapolis, the Chesapeake flashing silver through the trees. Maryland always looked dignified in autumn, like it understood its own history. Ethan had texted twice while I drove. Mom's gone overboard as usual, just smile and survive. Then, don't let Julian bait you, he thinks he's Cicero reincarnated. I smiled at that. At the time I thought it was affectionate. I should have known better. Ethan and I had been engaged for 6 months. We'd met 3 years earlier at a policy conference in Arlington, where I'd been speaking on strategic intelligence reform, and he'd been moderating a panel on constitutional litigation. He was handsome in the polished Georgetown way, tailored suits, expensive watches, that dark blonde hair, always just imperfect enough to look accidental. He had a quick wit and the kind of confidence that made people assume depth. At 45, he'd never married. His friends described him as discerning. When we met, he told people I was the most fascinating woman he'd ever known. I believed him. That was my mistake. I'm Claire Bennett, 42, retired Navy intelligence officer now teaching strategic military history at St. John's College in Annapolis. Officially, I spent 19 years specializing in linguistic analysis and operational coordination. Unofficially, there are things I still can't discuss. People hear Navy intelligence and imagine fluorescent offices and secure conference calls. Sometimes that was true. Sometimes it wasn't. What mattered was this: the work taught me to read people the way other women read novels. And somehow with Ethan I'd missed the ending. The Carlisle estate sat on 17 waterfront acres just outside town. White columns, perfect hedges, gravel driveway that whispered beneath your tires. The kind of house designed to remind visitors they were guests. I parked beside Ethan's silver Mercedes and checked my reflection in the mirror. Simple navy sheath dress, pearl earrings, hair pinned neatly back. Composed. The woman looking back at me had survived Kabul, Brussels, and 3 weeks in a Romanian safe house during a diplomatic breach. Surely she could survive dinner with future in-laws. Ethan opened the front door before I reached it. There she is, he said, kissing my cheek. He smelled like cedar and old bourbon. You look tense. I'm fine. He studied me for half a second. You know, my mother can smell anxiety. I laughed softly. Good thing I don't have any. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Inside the house glowed with old money warmth. Oil paintings, brass sconces, Persian rugs softened by generations of footsteps. Everything immaculate. Everything careful. Eleanor Carlisle greeted me with cool elegance. Claire, lovely dress. Not you look lovely. The dress did. Richard Carlisle appeared moments later, broad-shouldered despite his 74 years. His handshake was warm, direct. Good to see you again, Claire. He was the only member of Ethan's family who ever looked people fully in the eye. Then came Julian. 40, smug, recently divorced, and still somehow convinced prep school rowing victories counted as adult accomplishments. Well, he said, kissing the air near my cheek, our mystery woman returns. I smiled. Still mysterious after all this time. Some women improve with ambiguity. Ethan chuckled. Everyone chuckled. I smiled politely. That phrase would come to define the evening. Cocktails were served in the library. Julian and Ethan drifted naturally into Latin, tossing phrases back and forth like tennis volleys. It didn't surprise me. Elite East Coast boys often collect dead languages the way Texans collect hunting rifles. Display pieces. Julian quoted Horace badly. Ethan corrected him. I said nothing. At one point, Richard glanced at me curiously, but I only smiled. Let them perform. Dinner was served at 8 sharp. The dining room overlooked the bay moonlight, silvering the black water beyond tall windows. Eleanor had seated me between Ethan and Richard. Conversation stayed pleasantly shallow: politics, university funding, local preservation projects. Then Julian mentioned classical education. Ethan smirked. And in Latin low enough to seem private but loud enough for the table to hear, he said, "Non intelligi, tantum ridea et annua." Soft laughter followed. I turned my wineglass slowly between my fingers. For one strange second, I saw my 20-year-old self in a Georgetown lecture hall, Professor Moretti pacing before us, insisting that language was never about words. It was about power. Who assumes understanding? Who withholds it? Who reveals it? So I lifted my eyes to Ethan and answered, "Intellego satis, etiam superbiam tuam." The silence that followed was exquisite. And in Ethan's face I saw something crack. Not embarrassment. Recognition. For the first time since we met, he realized he had no idea who I really was. The silence lasted only a few seconds. But in families like the Carlyles, where every pause carried generations of practiced meaning, a few seconds could feel like a verdict. Ethan recovered first. He laughed. Too quickly. Too brightly. Well, he said, clearing his throat, that's one way to make an impression. No one joined him. Julian's face had gone oddly pale beneath his summer tan. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again as though he'd forgotten what expression he meant to wear. Across the table, Eleanor Carlyle sat unnaturally still, one elegant hand resting against the stem of her wineglass. Her blue eyes had sharpened with sudden interest. And Richard? Richard Carlyle was studying me the way intelligence officers study satellite photos after receiving unexpected confirmation. Quietly. Carefully. Reassessing everything. Then in measured formal Latin he asked, "Ubi didicisti?" Where did you learn? The question was flawless. Not the ornamental Latin of prep school men performing sophistication over cocktails, not memorized fragments dusted off to impress dinner guests. This was living academic Latin, precise and economical. For the first time all evening I felt genuine curiosity. I answered without hesitation, "Apud Georgetownensem universitatem, sed amor linguae multo antequepit." At Georgetown University, but my love for the language began long before. Richard inclined his head. Approval flickered in his eyes. Julian shifted in his chair. "Dad, really?" Richard ignored him. "Still in Latin?" he asked. "And before Georgetown?" I smiled. Akron Public Schools, a stubborn librarian and a second-hand copy of Cicero. That got his attention. Not because Akron was impressive. Because it wasn't. Old families like the Carlyles understand pedigree, they rarely understand effort. For the first time that evening, Richard smiled. A self-made classicist. I answered with a line from Cicero itself. Nescire autem quid antequam natus sis accideritid est semper sepuerum. To be ignorant of what came before your birth is to remain forever a child. A small sound escaped Eleanor. Not laughter. Recognition. She knew enough Latin to understand what had just happened. And more importantly, she understood that I had won. Not cruelly. Not theatrically. Simply by being exactly who I had always been. The rest of dinner stumbled forward on uncertain legs. English returned to the table, but awkwardly now, like guests arriving late to a gathering already changed. Julian withdrew into sullen silence. Eleanor redirected conversation toward neutral territory, charitable boards, local politics, the upcoming Naval Academy Gala. Ethan became aggressively charming. He laughed too much, refilled glasses, too often interrupted people mid-sentence. To anyone who didn't know him well, he would have seemed perfectly at ease. But I knew Ethan, and I could see panic behind the polish. He kept glancing at me, searching for something. Anger, maybe? Vindication. A sign I intended to humiliate him further. Instead, I remained calm. That unsettled him most of all. Because Ethan had always believed emotional control was his gift. He had never realized mine ran deeper. As dessert arrived, a pecan tart Eleanor insisted came from a bakery in Georgetown. Despite tasting suspiciously homemade, I found myself drifting backward through memory. Back to Ohio. To winter. To the little brick library on Maple Avenue where Mrs. Callahan had first placed a worn Latin primer in my hands. I was 14 and hungry for somewhere else. Not physically hungry, though there'd been years when money was tight enough for that, too. Hungry in the way bright children often are when they grow up in places too small for their questions. My father worked maintenance at Goodyear. My mother taught third grade. Good people, honest people. But they lived practical lives, and practical lives have little use for dead languages. Mrs. Callahan had noticed me lingering near the classics shelf after school. "You look like a girl who wants answers," she'd said. Then she handed me Cicero. That was all it took. Language became escape first. Then discipline. Then identity. At Georgetown, professors assumed I came from old East Coast schools because my Latin was stronger than theirs. I never corrected them unless necessary. People reveal themselves through assumptions. That lesson later served me well in naval intelligence. And eventually it brought me to Ethan. We met in Arlington after my keynote on multinational intelligence coordination. He approached afterward smiling that polished smile. "You speak like someone who's forgotten more than I'll ever know." I laughed. He seemed sincere. For a while he was, or perhaps he only loved what he imagined I represented. Composure. Mystery. Competence that reflected well on him. It happens. Some men don't fall in love with women. They fall in love with possessing exceptional women. And the moment those women become fully human, complex, unknowable, independently formidable, the affection curdles into competition. I didn't know that yet. Not fully. But some part of me was beginning to understand. After dessert, Eleanor suggested coffee in the library. The room shifted there with visible relief. Safe ground. Bookshelves, leather chairs inherited authority. The Carlyles understood libraries better than dining tables after social defeat. As we settled near the fire, Richard approached me quietly. "Walk with me a moment." Ethan stiffened. I noticed. So did Richard. He said nothing. We stepped into the hallway where the low amber light softened the oil portraits watching from paneled walls. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Richard said, "You spent time in government service." Not a question. I met his gaze. Yes. He nodded once. "I served naval intelligence from 1973 to 1981. That surprised me. He gave a faint smile. "You carry it the same way. Years of classified work trained posture differently than civilian life ever could. Alertness settles into the bones. Most people never notice. Richard had. He studied me carefully. My son doesn't know who he's engaged to, does he?" The honesty of it caught me off guard. I could have deflected. Instead, I answered truthfully, "No, I don't believe he does." Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "That may be my greatest failure as a father." And for reasons I couldn't yet name, those words unsettled me far more than Ethan's insult ever had. Because for the first time all evening, someone in that house had spoken without performance. And it made me wonder whether I'd mistaken the wrong person for the Carlyle worth knowing. Richard's words followed me long after he returned to the library. That may be my greatest failure as a father. There had been no bitterness in his voice. No dramatic regret. Just the flat, honest weight of a man finally saying aloud something he'd understood for years and hoped might somehow correct itself if left unspoken. That kind of truth tends to linger. I stood alone in the hallway for another moment, listening to the distant murmur of voices drifting from the library. Laughter floated out a second later. Ethan's laughter. Easy, smooth, recovering. By the time I walked back in, his public face had been fully restored. He sat near the fireplace, one ankle crossed over his knee, smiling as Julian stumbled through some story about a disastrous sailing weekend in Newport. Eleanor was politely amused. Richard was listening with that patient expression fathers wear when their sons have grown old enough to disappoint them elegantly. Ethan glanced up as I entered. His smile widened half a shade. Ownership disguised as affection. "There she is." I smiled and sat beside him. He placed a proprietary hand against the small of my back. Anyone watching would have seen intimacy. What I felt was positioning. And for the first time I noticed how often he did it. At conferences, charity dinners, faculty receptions, that subtle guiding pressure as though he were helping me navigate rooms I had crossed far more dangerous than he could imagine. At the time I had mistaken it for tenderness. But tenderness does not steer. It steadies. The distinction arrived quietly like so many important realizations do. Coffee was served. Conversation drifted toward the upcoming wedding. Eleanor had opinions about flowers. Julian had opinions about venue security, though he'd never organized anything more complex than a yacht club fundraiser. Ethan had opinions about everything. I sat there smiling politely, and beneath that calm surface, something old and well-trained had begun taking inventory. In intelligence work, you learn to trust discomfort. Not panic. Not fear. Discomfort is quieter. It simply notes inconsistency. A smile held half a second too long. A phrase repeated too often. A pattern finally visible because enough small details have aligned. For months, perhaps years, I had filed Ethan's behavior under harmless categories. Confidence. Privilege. Social habit. Tonight those files were being reclassified. And once reclassification happens, you cannot unknow what you know. Around 10:30 the evening ended. Eleanor kissed my cheek with measured grace. Drive safely, Claire. Not warm. Not cold. But different. Something had shifted. Julian avoided eye contact altogether. Richard shook my hand and held it briefly. A soldier's handshake. Respect offered without display. Then Ethan walked me to my car beneath the sharp autumn stars. The gravel crunched under our shoes. The bay beyond the trees was black and still. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he gave a short laugh. Well, that was dramatic. I turned to face him. The porch light cast hard lines across his face, sharpening him into someone I suddenly realized I had never fully seen. Was it? Oh, come on, Claire. He smiled, but tension pinched the edges of it. You blindsided everyone. I answered a sentence spoken about me at my own dinner table. His expression tightened. It was a joke. Was it? That irritated him. Not the question itself, the calmness with which I asked it. Ethan had always done well against visible emotion. Anger he could charm, tears he could soothe, frustration he could out-argue. Stillness unsettled him. It was family teasing, he said. You know how people are. No, I said quietly. I know how your family is. His jaw flexed. There it was. The first crack. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as though intimacy could disguise control. You embarrassed me tonight. I let that settle between us. Not, I'm sorry if I hurt you. Not, I didn't realize that would upset you. Not even we embarrassed each other. Just, you embarrassed me. At last the truth standing in plain sight. I felt no anger. Only clarity. That seems to be the part upsetting you most. His eyes hardened. You're being sensitive. I almost smiled. There are certain phrases men use when they feel power slipping. You're overreacting. You misunderstood. You're too emotional. They're all variations of the same plea. Please return to the smaller version of yourself I was comfortable with. Years earlier in Brussels, a senior NATO liaison had tried something similar after underestimating my operational recommendations. He'd dismissed my analysis as perhaps overly intuitive. 3 weeks later, my assessment prevented a catastrophic intelligence leak. He apologized in private. Not because he'd changed. Because reality had cornered him. Ethan wasn't there yet. Maybe he never would be. I'm tired, I said. His expression softened instantly, relief flooding in. He thought retreat meant surrender. He kissed my forehead. That's all this is, long week, too much tension. I nodded once. Good night, Ethan. He smiled, reassured. See you Wednesday. Of course. Another mistake he made. Assuming calm agreement meant restored harmony. I drove back toward Annapolis beneath a cold, clear sky, the radio off the Chesapeake gleaming faintly to my right. The drive should have felt familiar. Instead, every mile felt like crossing invisible borders. When I reached my townhouse near campus, I poured a small bourbon and sat in the dark living room without turning on a light. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock. My engagement ring caught the moonlight. Simple platinum, elegant, expensive enough to reassure old families. I turned it slowly around my finger. And one by one memories surfaced. Ethan correcting my pronunciation of a French wine region I had literally visited on assignment. Ethan interrupting one of my lectures to clarify context for guests. Ethan joking to friends that I was brilliant but socially feral. Each moment small enough to dismiss, together unmistakable. The pattern was complete. And once a pattern completes, action follows. I removed the ring. held it in my palm, then slipped it into my purse. Not dramatically, not tearfully, simply as one files a report after reaching unavoidable conclusions. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes only after certainty. And when I woke before dawn, I already knew my future had changed. I just hadn't yet decided how to tell Ethan. The strange thing about certainty is how peaceful it feels. People imagine the end of an engagement as slammed doors, raised voices, shattered glasses, and dramatic midnight declarations. But real endings, especially the important ones, usually arrive quietly. They settle into the room and wait for you to notice them. The week after dinner at the Carlisle estate unfolded with almost insulting normalcy. I taught my classes at St. John's. I graded midterm essays on Clausewitz and strategic restraint. I met colleagues for coffee. I walked the old brick paths beneath the yellowing sycamores and listened to the bells from the chapel tower drift over campus like memory itself. And every morning I woke with the same calm knowledge. I was not going to marry Ethan Carlisle. I still hadn't told him. That wasn't hesitation. It was timing. Years in intelligence work teach patience. You don't act because emotion demands it. You act when conditions are right. And conditions, as it happened, were about to become ideal. Wednesday evening, Ethan called. His voice was bright, polished, affectionate. Good news. I was at my kitchen counter chopping rosemary for roast chicken. What kind of good news? Mother insisted we move the engagement party up. I paused. The engagement party had originally been scheduled for December after Thanksgiving. Why? She thinks momentum matters. That sounded exactly like Eleanor Carlisle. Appearances first, reflection later. When? Saturday, Georgetown Club, black tie. 3 days away. Conveniently impossible to decline without explanation. I smiled faintly. Perfect. That's sudden. I know, but it'll be wonderful. Everyone important will be there. Everyone important. Not everyone loved. Not everyone close to us. Important. The word landed exactly as he intended. Status disguised as celebration. When were you planning to tell me? I asked. A pause. Then that easy laugh. Oh, Claire, don't do that. Do what? Notice. Question. Exist independently of his assumptions. He softened his voice. You'll look beautiful. My mother's handling details. Just show up and let yourself be adored. There it was again. That subtle positioning. Smile and nod. The phrase echoed through my mind with almost comic precision. And for the first time I felt something dangerously close to amusement. Of course, I said. He exhaled, reassured. Wonderful, I'll pick you up at 7. After we hung up, I finished preparing dinner, poured a glass of wine, and sat alone at my dining table. The townhouse was warm and quiet. Outside leaves scraped softly along the sidewalk in the wind. I thought about calling Ethan then and ending it cleanly. Simple, civilized. But another thought arrived just as quickly. No, not revenge. Not humiliation. Just truth placed where it could no longer be ignored. If Ethan wanted an audience for performance, then perhaps the audience deserved honesty. Saturday arrived crisp and cold. By 6:30, Georgetown was glowing under soft amber street lamps, the old brick facades polished by generations of wealth and expectation. I stood before my bedroom mirror fastening pearl earrings. My dress was midnight blue silk, understated and severe enough to command attention without asking for it. The kind of elegance that doesn't need approval. I left my engagement ring in the velvet box on my dresser. Intentional. Not forgotten. At exactly 7, Ethan knocked. When I opened the door, his smile faltered. You're not wearing it. I held his gaze. No. A beat passed. Then he smiled again, tighter this time. Well, we'll fix that before photos. I said nothing. He mistook silence for compliance. Again. The Georgetown Club was everything one expects from old Washington. Money-polished walnut paneling, crystal chandeliers, discreetly expensive floral arrangements, staff who moved like choreography. The ballroom hummed with practiced prestige. Federal judges. Lobbyists. Professors. Retired admirals. Women in silk and diamonds discussing foundations they only half remembered funding. Men who still introduced themselves by former titles. The Carlisle world. And tonight I was meant to become part of it. Eleanor greeted us with air kisses and visible relief. "Claire, darling, there you are." Her eyes dropped instantly to my bare hand. A fractional pause. Then composure returned. Professional grade recovery. Lovely dress. Again, the dress received what I did not. Richard appeared moments later. His expression flicked once to my empty ring finger. Understanding settled quietly in his eyes. He said nothing, but he knew. And somehow that steadied me. The evening unfolded exactly as planned. Champagne circulated. Guests praised our future. Ethan played the attentive fiancé with polished precision. His hand rested lightly at my waist. His smile dazzled. His voice carried warmth calibrated to perfection. And all the while I watched him the way I once watched foreign dignitaries during classified negotiations, noting where performance strained against truth. At 9 sharp, Eleanor tapped her crystal flute for attention. The room quieted. She smiled toward Ethan. Our son would like to say a few words. Applause followed. Ethan stepped onto the low platform near the grand piano. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. Perfect confidence. He lifted his champagne glass. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate this extraordinary woman." The crowd smiled approvingly. He looked directly at me. And then I saw it. That glint. The same one he'd worn at dinner before speaking Latin. Performance sharpened by cruelty. "My Claire," he said warmly, "remains the most mysterious person I've ever known." Polite laughter. "She's brilliant, of course, though often in ways difficult to decode." More laughter. A gentle joke. Harmless enough. Then he switched to Latin. Confidently. Smoothly. And incorrectly. He intended. Even silence can conceal confusion. What he actually said, thanks to a badly declined participle, translated closer to. Even silence confuses itself while hiding. The room, of course, didn't know. But I did. And Richard did. And for one suspended second our eyes met across the ballroom. He gave the slightest nod. Permission. Or perhaps acknowledgement. Either way I understood. So before Ethan could continue, I stepped forward. And in clear, elegant Latin heard across the suddenly still room, I said, "You've declined the participle incorrectly." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. Ethan froze. I continued still in flawless Latin. If one wishes to insult a woman publicly, precision helps. A few guests laughed nervously. Then Richard laughed outright. The sound cracked the room open. And Ethan's perfect evening began to collapse. For half a second after Richard laughed, no one else moved. It was the kind of moment Washington society secretly lives for. Not charity galas. Not policy dinners. Not elegant speeches about duty and service. No. What people in rooms like that truly crave is rupture. The instant polished certainty breaks open and reveals whatever trembling truth has been hiding underneath. And there, under the crystal chandeliers of the Georgetown Club, Ethan Carlisle was trembling. His smile remained in place, but it had become mechanical now, like a light left burning in an empty house. He looked at me as though he couldn't quite understand what he was seeing. Not because I had corrected his Latin, because I had done it calmly. Without anger, without apology, and without needing anyone's permission. The crowd shifted uneasily, their instincts splitting in 2 directions. One half wanted to pretend nothing unusual had happened. The other half wanted front-row seats. Washington is full of cowards and spectators. Often the same people. Ethan recovered quickly, too quickly. That had always been his gift. He laughed and spread his hands. "Well," he said, his voice smooth but brittle at the edges, "there you have it. Proof I should never attempt classics in front of Claire." Scattered laughter answered. The room was offering him escape. A lesser humiliation. A chance to reframe this as charming banter. For a brief moment I considered letting him have it. Ending things quietly afterward. No scene. No public reckoning. That would have been easier. Kinder, perhaps. Then he looked directly at me and said, "That's what makes her so fascinating. Brilliant, inscrutable. Occasionally difficult to keep up with socially, but intellectually impossible to fault." More laughter. Soft. Encouraging. And there it was. The same move he had always made. Dress-down cruelty as sophistication. Mockery wrapped in polished affection. Invite the room to smile along. I realized then that if I walked away quietly, he would spend the rest of his life telling this story as evidence of my coldness, my mystery, my impossible standards. And people would believe him. Not because he was right, because he was practiced. So I smiled, and stepped fully onto the platform beside him. The room stilled again. Ethan's expression flickered. Just briefly. He hadn't expected movement. I took the microphone gently from his hand. He let go because refusing would have looked absurd. Then I turned to the crowd. Nearly 200 faces watched beneath warm chandelier light. Judges. Professors. Old family friends. Military officers. The kind of Americans who had spent their lives believing dignity meant never raising one's voice. Good. So had I. My fiancé is right about one thing, I said. My voice carried evenly through the ballroom. I am difficult to decode. A ripple of polite laughter. I smiled faintly. That happens when someone spends 19 years in naval intelligence. The laughter stopped. A murmur moved through the room. I saw several retired officers straighten instinctively. Until that moment, Ethan had never told most of them what I had done. He had always described my career vaguely. Government consulting. Strategic analysis. Academic work. Things that sounded impressive but abstract. Nothing that might require him to share the spotlight. I continued. My work required discretion, precision, listening carefully enough to hear what people reveal when they assume you cannot understand them. Now no one moved at all. Across the room, Richard Carlyle stood perfectly still. Not surprised. Proud. And for reasons I would only understand later that mattered. I turned toward Ethan. He had gone pale. There was no anger in his face now. Only fear. Not fear of me. Fear of exposure. The fear all carefully constructed men carry. The terror that one day someone will speak plainly. So I did. When Ethan and I first met, I admired his intelligence, his confidence, his ambition. My eyes stayed on his. I thought those qualities reflected character. Silence. His throat moved. He knew what was coming. But there are moments when consequence arrives too late to negotiate with. Instead, I said gently, I've learned confidence without humility becomes contempt. Intelligence without kindness becomes performance. No one breathed. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. I reached into my evening clutch, removed the platinum ring, held it between my fingers. A small object. A heavy truth. Ethan whispered Claire. Not loud enough for the room. Just for me. A plea. But not the right one. Not I'm sorry. Not I understand. Only, please don't. And after everything, that was what made my choice easiest. I placed the ring carefully on the silver champagne tray nearest the stage. The soft metallic click echoed through the ballroom. Then I looked at him one final time. You once told your brother I should smile and nod. His face drained of all color. A visible tremor passed through him. Gasps fluttered through the room as understanding spread. I smiled not cruelly but honestly. You were half right. I set down the microphone and walked away. No one tried to stop me? Not Ethan. Not Eleanor. Not Julian. Only Richard moved. As I passed, he touched my arm lightly. A soldier's gesture. Respect. Nothing more. Outside, Georgetown's cold night air struck my face like baptism. The street glowed amber beneath old lamps. Cars moved quietly past on Wisconsin Avenue. Life continuing indifferent and immense. For the first time in years, I could breathe without calculation. I stood there for several moments looking up at the dark Washington sky. Then I laughed. Softly. Not from triumph. From relief. There is a profound peace that arrives when performance finally ends. I drove home through the sleeping city with the windows cracked to let in the November cold. No music. No tears. Just stillness. When I reached Annapolis after midnight, I poured bourbon into my father's old glass tumbler and sat by the window overlooking campus. The chapel bell struck 1. And for the first time since accepting Ethan's proposal, I felt entirely like myself. The phone began ringing at 7:12 the next morning. I let it ring. At 7:14 it rang again. At 7:18 my doorbell sounded. And somehow before I even rose from my chair, I already knew it wasn't Ethan. It was Richard. Richard Carlisle stood on my front porch wearing a navy wool overcoat and holding a white bakery box tied with simple string. For a man who had likely spent decades entering rooms from positions of unquestioned authority, he looked unexpectedly uncertain. Not weak. Not ashamed. Just careful. The kind of careful that comes when a person finally understands the importance of getting something right. When I opened the door, he gave a slight nod. Claire. Richard. He lifted the box a little. Blueberry scones from Lighthouse Bistro. I'm told apologies should never arrive empty-handed. For the first time since the engagement party, I smiled. A real smile. Well, I said, stepping aside, that's certainly better than flowers. His mouth twitched. Flowers are often just expensive evasions. I liked him more for saying it. He entered quietly, pausing just inside the foyer to glance around. My townhouse was modest by Carlisle standards, brick narrow overlooking the old streets near St. John's, but warm. Books lined nearly every wall. Framed maps from naval operations I was legally allowed to display hung above the fireplace. The furniture was practical and worn in ways that suggested use rather than curation. Nothing had been selected to impress anyone. That alone probably made it alien to him. I led him to the kitchen. The late morning sun poured through the windows, catching the steam rising from the coffee I'd just made. He set down the pastry box and removed his coat. For a while we moved through the familiar choreography of civility, pouring coffee-setting plates, making small observations about weather and traffic. Older people understand this dance better than younger ones. Sometimes practical motions allow truth to gather courage. At last Richard folded his hands around his coffee cup and looked at me directly. I came to apologize. You already did. Not sufficiently. Fair enough. I waited. He drew a slow breath. I spent years teaching Ethan how to succeed. Schools, connections, discipline, presentation. His mouth tightened faintly. I neglected to teach him humility because I assumed life would do it for me. The honesty of it struck harder than any polished apology could have. There was no self-protection in his tone. No attempt to lessen responsibility. Just truth. I leaned back in my chair. That's rare. He gave me a tired smile. At 74, one grows too old for decorative lies. We sat in silence for a moment. Comfortable silence. Then he said he was here at dawn. That surprised me. At the estate. He nodded. He looked like he hadn't slept. I said nothing. Richard's expression softened, not with pity for his son, but recognition. He asked whether I thought you'd overreacted. I almost laughed. What did you tell him? His eyes held mine. I told him no woman with your bearing overreacts, she observes. Then she acts once she's certain. The words landed deeper than I expected. Because he understood. Not just what had happened. Who I was. Recognition is a rare form of respect. And perhaps the most valuable. He was angry, I asked. At first. Richard took a sip of coffee. Then defensive, then ashamed. He set down the cup carefully. Eventually he cried. That startled me more than anything else. Not because Ethan was incapable of emotion. Because he had always treated vulnerable emotion as failure. Richard saw my surprise. He hasn't cried since he was 14. What changed? He gave a sad smile. For the first time, there was no one left willing to tell him he was right. The kitchen fell quiet again. Outside, dry leaves skittered across the sidewalk. A church bell sounded faintly from downtown Annapolis. Life moving steadily forward. Richard looked around the room. He underestimated you because I taught him to admire polish over substance. I considered that. It was partly true. But not all of it. No, I said gently. You taught him many things. He chose which lessons to keep. Richard absorbed that without flinching. Another mark of character. Finally, he nodded. Yes, that's true. We spoke for nearly 3 hours after that. Not about Ethan mostly. About service. About discipline. About the strange loneliness of leadership. He told me stories from naval intelligence during the late 70s, Moscow analyses, Mediterranean operations, tense Cold War briefings, where one misunderstood sentence might alter history. I told him what little I safely could about my own years overseas. Enough for shared understanding, not enough to violate trust. And gradually something remarkable happened. The father of the man I had nearly married became simply Richard, an aging officer reckoning honestly with his life. By noon, the sunlight had shifted pale and cool across the kitchen tiles. He stood to leave. At the door, he hesitated. Then he said quietly, "For what it's worth, Claire, I would have been proud to call you family." The words caught me off guard, because they held no manipulation, no implied regret. Only truth offered too late for use, but still worth saying. I smiled. "That means more than you know." He nodded once. Then he left. For several moments after the door closed, I stood there in the stillness he left behind. Not grieving, not relieved, simply thoughtful. Some endings leave bitterness. This one had left understanding. That afternoon, I walked across campus beneath a cold, bright sky, hands in my coat pockets, watching students hurry between classes with their scarves flying behind them. The world felt sharper somehow, cleaner, as though some long-fogged window had finally cleared. And then as I turned onto King George Street, I saw Ethan standing beside my car, waiting. No polished smile, no tailored confidence. Just a tired man in yesterday's suit staring down at fallen leaves gathering near the curb. He looked up when he heard my footsteps, and in that single glance I knew this would be the first honest conversation we had ever had. Ethan looked older than he had 3 days earlier. Not dramatically older. Not gray-haired overnight or hollowed by some theatrical collapse. Just worn in the way people look when certainty has finally abandoned them. His tie was gone. His collar stood open and slightly wrinkled. There were dark half-moons beneath his eyes, and for once his hair was not carefully arranged into that studied imperfection he'd spent years mastering. He looked, I realized, like a man who had stopped rehearsing. For reasons I couldn't entirely explain, that made what followed easier. He gave a small nod. "Claire." "Ethan." Neither of us moved closer. Students passed behind us, laughing softly, backpacks slung over their shoulders, wrapped in scarves against the cold. Somewhere across campus, chapel bells marked the quarter hour. Ordinary life moving around extraordinary endings. It felt right. He glanced down for a moment, then back up. "My father was here this morning. He told me." Ethan gave a humorless laugh. "I imagine he was kinder to you than he was to me." I said nothing. He looked at the brick sidewalk between us. He said, "I've spent my whole life confusing admiration with love." The honesty of that surprised me. Not because it wasn't true. Because Ethan was saying it aloud. There was no audience here. No social leverage to recover. No polished crowd to perform for. Just two people standing under a cold Annapolis sky, finally speaking plainly. "That must have been difficult to hear," I said. He smiled faintly. It was worse hearing that he was right. We stood in silence for a moment. Then he looked at me fully. Not appraising. Not persuading. Simply looking. And for the first time since I'd known him, I saw no calculation there. Only exhaustion. And grief. Not grief for losing status or appearances or the spectacle of a failed engagement. Real grief. The kind that comes when illusion dies and leaves truth standing in its place. "I loved you," he said quietly. It would have been easy to reject that. To tell him he'd loved the idea of me. To correct him. To win. But age teaches something younger people rarely understand. Truth is often layered. And people can love badly while still loving sincerely. "I know," I said. His shoulders loosened slightly, as if some hidden tension had finally found permission to release. Then he asked the question I think he had come there dreading most. "When did you know?" The answer arrived easily. "At your parents' dinner." He nodded once, unsurprised. "The Latin." "Yes." He swallowed. "I've replayed that moment all weekend." The wind stirred dry leaves around our shoes. His voice dropped lower. "When you answered me, I realized I'd never once asked who you really were before me. There it was. The heart of it. Not cruelty exactly. Neglect. A subtler failure and in many ways a sadder one. He had loved the Claire who fit neatly into his world. The composed woman beside him at events. The elegant professor who reflected well on him. The mystery he could display. He had never paused long enough to meet the full person standing inside all that quietness. And because he had not looked deeply, he had mistaken depth for emptiness. "I'm sorry," he said. No polish. No cleverness. Just 2 words offered plainly. And because they were real, I believed them. "Thank you." His eyes searched mine. Not for rescue. For understanding. I thought confidence meant always being the smartest person in the room. I smiled faintly. "That's insecurity wearing expensive tailoring." A soft laugh escaped him. Real this time. He shook his head. "You always did speak like a classified report. That's years of government service." That earned another quiet laugh. Then his expression gentled. "You frightened me, Claire." The admission startled us both. He saw it and continued. "Not because of your intelligence, because you never needed anything from me. There was the final truth. At last fully visible. So many people build relationships on negotiated dependency. Need becomes reassurance. Control becomes intimacy. But I had never needed Ethan to complete me, validate me, or steady me. I had wanted him. And to someone insecure enough, wanting can feel terrifyingly fragile compared to need. You could have walked away at any moment, he said. Yes. And I hated knowing that. I nodded. I know. He looked toward the chapel spire rising pale against the November sky. Then he said very softly, "You were the first person I couldn't impress into loving me." There was no self-pity in it. Only discovery. And because I understood what it had cost him to say that, I answered honestly. "You never needed to impress me, Ethan." He closed his eyes briefly. A long breath left him. When he opened them again, something had changed. Acceptance. Not peace, not yet. But the first step toward it. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. My engagement ring. He held it out. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I shook my head. "Keep it." He looked surprised. "Why?" "Because someday when this hurts less, it may remind you of something worth learning." He studied me, then nodded slowly and slipped it back into his pocket. No argument. No performance. Just understanding. At last. We stood there another moment, 2 people sharing the strange tenderness that sometimes survives where romance cannot. Then Ethan gave a small smile. "Goodbye, Claire." "Goodbye, Ethan." He turned and walked slowly down King George Street, hands in his coat pockets, shoulders bowed, not by defeat but by thought. I watched until he disappeared beyond the old stone wall. Then I turned toward my office. Winter arrived fully a few weeks later. The semester ended. Life settled into its steady rhythms. I taught. I read. I walked the harbor at dusk beneath bare trees and sharp salt air. And on Christmas Eve, a package arrived at my front door. No return address, but I knew immediately who had sent it. Inside was an old leather-bound Latin text, its pages softened by decades of use. Richard's naval annotations filled the margins in neat blue ink. Tucked inside the cover was a single handwritten note. To someone who understood silence better than any of us. I stood very still for a long time. Then I smiled. The next morning I carried the book to campus for my winter seminar. A student stumbled over a translation from Cicero and frowned at the page. I leaned down gently and corrected him. Outside the classroom window, snow drifted softly across the old brick paths of Annapolis. Quiet. Patient. Falling without hurry. And standing there, surrounded by young voices learning old truths, I thought about all the ways life humbles us into becoming ourselves. Sometimes through loss. Sometimes through love. Sometimes through a single sentence spoken carelessly across a dinner table. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a moment when silence taught more than anger ever could, perhaps carry that reflection forward. Share it with someone who may need it or stay a while, and listen to another story. Sometimes understanding arrives quietly and stays if we make room for it. Then I opened Richard's old book and began again.